She had 11 minutes to disappear before the man who owned half the Pacific Northwest discovered she was carrying his child and that she'd been sent to destroy him. The rain fell in sheets against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanthorpe estate, turning the Columbia River below into a roiling black mirror. Mara Sinclair pressed her palm flat against her stomach, still flat, still secret, and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat counting down the seconds she had left. Somewhere below, security rotations were changing. Somewhere in Seattle, the federal case she'd abandoned was gathering dust in a prosecutor's drawer. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the version of herself who had walked into Cole Vanthorpe's world as an undercover forensic accountant was screaming at the woman who now stood in his bedroom, passport in hand, trying to remember why she'd chosen to run. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me through all 5 parts. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Mara's story reaches. The estate sat on a bluff above the Columbia River Gorge like something carved from the landscape rather than built upon it, all dark timber and rain-slicked glass, brutalist and beautiful in equal measure. Cole Vanthorpe had not designed it to be welcoming. He had designed it to be impenetrable. Mara had spent 6 months learning exactly why that distinction mattered. She moved through the East Corridor now with the precision of someone who had memorized the blind spots in every surveillance system, the exact duration of each guard rotation, the 3 seconds of signal delay that affected the motion sensors on the lower terrace. She'd gathered that knowledge the way she'd been trained to gather everything quietly, systematically, without being seen. The irony was not lost on her that those same skills deployed originally to build a federal case against the man whose child she was carrying had become the tools of her escape from him. 11 minutes. She'd calculated it down to the breath. The duffel bag on her shoulder was light by design, cash documents, a prepaid phone still in its packaging, and a single item that had no business being there, a small onesie sage green purchased 3 weeks ago from a boutique in Hood River, while Cole's driver waited outside, thinking she was browsing for a birthday gift. The fabric was so soft it almost hurt to touch. She'd folded it into a Ziploc bag like evidence. In some ways it was. Mara was 9 weeks pregnant with Cole Vanthorpe's child. She had not told him. She was not going to. The decision had crystallized on the same Tuesday morning she'd sat in the single-stall bathroom of a coffee shop in Cascade Falls and watched 2 pink lines appear on a drugstore test, her Americano going cold on the table outside. She'd stared at those lines for a long time, long enough that the barista knocked once and asked if everything was okay, long enough that she'd had to answer yes with a steadiness she did not feel. And then she had done what every version of her training had prepared her to do in moments of operational crisis. She'd made a plan. The plan was simple. Leave. Disappear. Surface somewhere Cole Vanthorpe's reach did not extend, which meant leaving the country if necessary, because his reach was considerable. It was less simple than it had been before the 2 pink lines, because now the stakes were no longer just professional. They were permanent. She'd known who Cole was long before she'd met him. Everyone in the Pacific Northwest Financial Crimes Division knew who he was. Third-generation shipping magnate chairman of Vanthorpe Maritime Holdings, holder of more port access contracts than any private entity in the region, and the subject of a 3-year federal investigation into whether those contracts had been obtained through a systematic pattern of bribery, money laundering, and coercion that had cost 3 competing firms their operating licenses and 1 whistleblower his career. Mara had been assigned to the case as a forensic accountant. Her job had been to follow the money. She had followed it through shell corporations in the Caymans, through equity transfers that appeared legitimate until you understood what they were concealing, through 7 layers of accounting that were so elegantly constructed she'd found herself genuinely admiring the architecture of it, even as she documented every brick. And then she had met Cole. It hadn't been an accident. Nothing in that investigation had been accidental. She'd been placed at the Pacific Crest Founders Summit in Portland under a cover identity positioned to cross paths with him at a reception where the guest list read like a who's who of Pacific Northwest power. Her supervisor had briefed her that morning: make contact, establish rapport, determine whether Cole Vanthorpe was the architect of the laundering scheme or a figure whose name was being used by someone deeper in the organization. She'd walked into that reception ready. She had not been ready for him. He'd been standing near the windows with a drink he wasn't touching, watching the room with the contained attention of someone who found most of it vaguely disappointing. Not arrogance exactly, something more specific than that. The look of a man who had learned early that the version of the world other people found impressive rarely matched the version in his own head. When his eyes had moved to her across the room, they hadn't swept her the way men's eyes usually did. They'd landed, stayed, like he was trying to determine something. "You're not supposed to be here," he'd said when she reached him, and her stomach had dropped, but then he'd continued. "There were supposed to be 30 people at this reception. There are 42. Either someone padded the guest list or you crashed it." "Would crashing it be a problem?" she'd said. "Depends entirely on why you came." She'd given him the cover story she was a financial consultant. Independent practice worked primarily with mid-size enterprises on restructuring. He'd listened with the focused patience of someone who was very good at detecting lies, and she'd told herself afterward that the warmth she'd felt under that attention was just the success of the performance, just tradecraft. She told herself that for approximately 6 weeks. By the time she understood that what she felt for Cole Vanthorpe was real, was the most real thing she'd experienced in 4 years of undercover work that had gradually eroded every authentic relationship in her life. She had also accumulated enough evidence to indict him 3 times over. She had sat in her car outside the federal building in Portland for 45 minutes before her case review meeting, her laptop. Opened the financial files on one side of the screen and a text from Cole on the other. Just the name of a restaurant. A question mark, the easy shorthand of 2 people who had developed a language together, and she had felt something in her crack open so completely and so quietly that it made no sound at all. She'd gone into the building, she'd submitted her preliminary findings. She'd said nothing about the fact that her cover had shifted into something she no longer recognized as cover. And 3 days later, when Cole had told her the truth, not all of it, not the laundering, he'd never confessed that, and she still didn't know even now whether the scheme had been his design or something constructed around him by subordinates. He trusted too much. But he told her something else, something she hadn't been looking for and hadn't known how to file anywhere in her operational framework, that he was afraid of her. That he'd been afraid of her since the night at the reception, because she was the first person in recent memory who'd made the room he was standing in feel smaller, more vivid, more specifically worth being in. That he didn't know what to do with that. She'd kissed him. It was the single most unprofessional thing she had ever done in her professional life, and she'd done it with her full awareness that it would eventually destroy everything, and she had done it anyway. She'd requested a reassignment the next morning, citing personal conflicts with the case structure. Her supervisor had approved it with some suspicion but no specific objection. The investigation had continued without her. Cole had never known she'd been part of it, and she'd spent the following 9 months trying to convince herself that she could hold both truths simultaneously, that she cared for this man and that the question of what he'd done remained open and dangerous until the morning the 2 pink lines had resolved it for her. She couldn't stay in a life built on a foundation of what she didn't know and what she hadn't told him. She couldn't bring a child into that particular architecture of silence. She had to go. The service exit was through the mudroom off the kitchen, past a panel she'd watched the estate manager disarm so many times she could do it. Blind 4 digits. Cole's grandmother's birth year 1943, because for all his calculation, he was quietly sentimental about the women who'd shaped him. The panel beeped once and released. The cold air of the gorge hit her like a verdict. She ran. The rain was serious, and the path down the bluff was treacherous. Loose gravel, slick with water, the timber-retaining walls offering handholds that were wet and cold. She'd mapped the route in daylight, walked it twice on the pretense of photographing the river from the lower terrace, and she moved now with the careful speed of someone who could not afford to fall. Below her, the lights of the estate receded. Above her, the sky was the color of a bruise. At the bottom of the service road she'd hidden a rental car 2 days ago, paid cash. Different nameplates registered to a business entity that didn't lead back to her. She'd done it with the same methodical patience she'd once applied to building financial cases, redirecting those skills toward the architecture of her own disappearance. The car started on the first try. She drove north. The Portland bus terminal at 3 in the morning was exactly as bleak as its reputation suggested, fluorescent light over everything, the smell of industrial cleaner, and something less identifiable travelers who had the particular stillness of people accustomed to waiting in places where waiting was the only option. Mara bought a ticket north with cash and took a seat near the back where she could watch the doors. The baby, she'd been thinking of it as the baby for 3 weeks now, not as the pregnancy or the situation or the complication, Just the baby made itself known with a wave of nausea that she breathed through carefully. "You picked a dramatic entrance," she told it very quietly. The bus pulled out at 4:15 a.m., and she watched the city lights of Portland fall away behind her with the specific feeling of crossing a threshold you know you won't cross back. Vancouver was 4 hours north. She'd chosen it for the same reasons she'd chosen Toronto in a different life for a different kind of flight, big enough to disappear and far enough to complicate pursuit home to a network of support organizations she'd researched with professional thoroughness. She crossed the border on foot at a smaller crossing point. Her documentation clean, her demeanor, the studied neutrality of someone who crossed borders professionally and found nothing remarkable about it. Canada let her in. She found a room in a residential building in East Vancouver. Clean, anonymous, affordable, and paid 3 months in advance with cash while giving a name that was real but rarely used. The building manager didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. She'd chosen him for exactly that quality. She spent the first week in a state of exhausted dislocation, sleeping 10 hours and waking in rooms she had to reorient herself to eating whatever her body would accept, which was not much. The baby had opinions about food that did not align with her own. She craved things she couldn't explain and rejected things she'd previously loved, and she found the whole process of being overruled by a creature the size of a lime to be simultaneously absurd and oddly comforting. She was not alone in the way she had been in her undercover years. There was someone with her now, even if that someone currently had no capacity to reciprocate. She registered with a prenatal clinic on the 4th day under her real name, the one Cole didn't know. She found work within 2 weeks consulting remotely for a legitimate financial services firm that needed someone who understood complex corporate structures and didn't ask why she preferred video calls to in-person meetings. The pay was adequate. The work was clean. She could do it from the small desk in her room with her headphones in and the rain on the window and the baby gradually making its presence less queasy and more simply present. By her 12th week, she had started to believe she might actually be free. It was a fragile belief. She'd known enough about Cole Vanthorpe to understand that men with his resources did not simply accept the disappearance of someone they considered, and she was precise about this word, had turned it over many times important. Not his. He had never been explicit enough about possession to use that word. But important, yes. She was important to him in the way that rare things are important to people who have learned to recognize rarity with a focused, somewhat relentless attention. She'd been careful. More careful than she'd ever been professionally, because the professional stakes had never felt like this. New phone, new accounts, no contact with anyone from her previous life. The federal investigation had been absorbed into a broader case restructuring after her departure. She had no official obligations tethering her to anything on either side of that history. She told herself she was invisible. She told herself that until the morning she came home from the prenatal clinic 16 weeks pregnant, the appointment having confirmed everything was progressing exactly as it should. The baby's heartbeat strong and rhythmic and utterly indifferent to the complexity of its circumstances, and found a package outside her apartment door. No postage, no return address. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a single item, a first edition of a book she'd mentioned once in passing in a conversation with Cole 9 months ago. A collection of Pacific Northwest landscape photography she'd said she'd never been able to find. She'd said it the way you say things to someone you're starting to trust casually, not anticipating that it would be cataloged and retrieved. The note was 3 words. "I'm not angry." Her hands were shaking when she reached for her phone. She didn't call him. She sat on the floor of her hallway with her back against the door and her palm flat on her stomach, and thought about what 3 words from Cole Vanthorpe actually meant, and what they didn't, and what she was going to do now that the geography of invisible had collapsed. He found her 4 days later. She was leaving the clinic after a routine appointment, the Vancouver afternoon gray and soft with mist, when a car pulled to the curb beside her, dark, expensive, the specific anonymity of a vehicle chosen not to be noticed by people who didn't know what to look for. The window lowered. Cole looked exactly as she remembered, and somehow worse for it because remembering had allowed her to soften the details to make him more manageable in her mind, and the actual man made no allowances for manageability. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not fury, not triumph at having located her. Something more careful than either. "I'll drive you home," he said. "You shouldn't be standing in the rain." "I'm fine. You're 16 weeks pregnant and it's 41 degrees. Get in the car, Mara." She got in the car. The interior smelled like cedar and rain, and the specific quality of Cole's presence that she'd spent 4 months trying to stop associating with safety, because safety was not a word that should apply to a man whose financial structures she'd once cataloged for a federal investigation. But the body remembered what the mind tried to argue away, and her body had always recognized Cole as the wrong kind of sanctuary. "How long have you known where I was?" she asked. "Long enough?" He was looking ahead, not at her. "I wanted to give you time to understand that I wasn't going to pursue you in the way you were expecting." What way was I expecting? The way I would have 6 months ago. A pause. "I've been thinking about what that would have meant, what it would have looked like from your side." Mara studied his profile, and I didn't like what I saw. The silence in the car was dense with everything neither of them had said. In a year, the layered truth of who she'd been when they met the question of who he'd been, and possibly still was the baby, that was the most concrete consequence of all that silence taking up a particular square of space in her midsection. "You know," she said finally, "not a question. That you're pregnant, yes. That it's mine." His jaw tightened slightly. "I assumed, if you want to correct that assumption. It's yours." He absorbed that with the stillness of someone who'd already known, but had been waiting for the word from her mouth to make it official. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because everything about us is complicated in ways that don't resolve cleanly, Cole. Because I didn't know how to have that conversation without having 10 other conversations first, and I wasn't sure I was ready for any of them. And now you've driven up beside me in the rain, and I'm apparently having them all simultaneously so." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. "I booked a suite at the Hotel Georgia. I'm not asking you to come back with me. I'm asking you to have dinner and a conversation that we should have had a long time ago. After that, you can do whatever you decide to do, and I won't stop you." She looked at him for a long moment. "You could have led with that instead of the car ambush." "I was worried you'd say no." "I might still say no. I know." He finally looked at her then, and the full weight of his attention landed the same way it always had, with the disorienting precision of something she hadn't prepared for. "But I'm hoping you won't." She didn't say no. The Hotel Georgia was exactly what Vancouver's Hotel Georgia always was. Dark wood and careful lighting, and the particular atmosphere of a place that had witnessed enough significant conversations to have developed a personality from them. The suite was large without being aggressive about it, overlooking Robson Street, where the evening crowd moved in streams below. Cole had arranged food without asking what she wanted, a range of things, as if he'd considered she might not be certain which was accurate, and Mara found herself eating more than she'd intended while they circled the edges of the conversation neither of them had started yet. "Tell me what you've been doing," she said, because it was easier than what they both knew was coming. "Restructuring." He said it simply without elaboration. "The business, among other things." He turned his glass in his hands. "There are things I've been involved in that I'm not proud of. Arrangements that were made in ways that I knew were wrong and told myself were necessary. I've been ending them." Mara set down her fork. "Cole, I'm not confessing. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you something true, because I think we've spent a significant amount of time not telling each other things that were true. And I'm tired of it." His eyes were steady on hers. "I know you weren't just a financial consultant when we met." The sentence landed like a stone into still water. "I don't know the specifics," he continued. "I don't know who sent you or what you found or what you did with it, and I'm not asking not tonight. But I'm not stupid, Mara. I knew something was complicated about you from the first night. I chose not to press it because I didn't want to know the answer." He paused. That was cowardice. The word was unexpected. She'd anticipated anger or calculation, or the particular pride of a man who'd been surveilled without his knowledge. She hadn't anticipated that. "It wasn't only cowardice," she said carefully. "No, it was also fear of losing something I'd found before I'd had time to understand what it was." He leaned forward slightly. "What did you find in the accounts?" She was quiet for a moment. "Enough to be a problem. Enough that I requested reassignment, which my supervisor approved." "You walked away from the case?" "Yes." "Because of me." "Because of me," she corrected. "Because I'd compromised my objectivity, and I knew it, and continuing would have been dishonest to the investigation and to you, even if you never knew I was there." Cole absorbed that. "Is there still an active case?" "Not one I'm connected to. I left federal work entirely 8 months ago. Whatever happens legally with your business affairs, it doesn't involve me. I want it on record between us that I'm not telling you any of this to influence any investigation. What I told you about the restructuring that's happening because it needs to happen. Because I've been building something that I wouldn't want my... He stopped. Wouldn't want a child to be proud of. The word he'd almost used sat between them. Mara looked at the city lights through the window. What are you asking for Cole from tonight? Tonight I'm asking for honesty. After that, I want to be part of this child's life, whatever form that takes. He paused. I want to negotiate what that looks like with you rather than have it decided by lawyers operating at arm's length. I want to try to do this right. That's a lot of wants. I've been sitting on them for 4 months. You knew for 4 months. I suspected. The book confirmed it when I left it. I wasn't sure you'd stayed. Something crossed his face that she recognized now as the specific quality of Cole's vulnerability, which he wore like a man unaccustomed to the weight of it. You didn't call. I took that as a signal you needed more time. I didn't call because I didn't know what to say. I know. He stood and moved to the window, his back to her. I'm not the same man you met a year ago. I'm not sure I was ever exactly that man. I think you were seeing a version of me that had started to become possible because of you. And then you were gone, and I had to figure out whether that version could exist without the catalyst. And he turned. It can. It's harder, but it can. Mara stood because sitting felt suddenly passive for a conversation with this much weight in it. She moved to stand beside him at the window, not touching, watching the street below. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. Real ones. Non-negotiable ones that I want in writing before I agree to anything. All right. I keep my independence. My work, my residence, my schedule, those are mine. Any agreement we reach about co-parenting doesn't come with provisions about my personal choices. Agreed. I want my own legal representation reviewing everything before either of us signs. Of course. And I want an honest accounting of what you're restructuring, and why not because I'm going to report it anywhere, but because I can't build anything with someone whose circumstances I don't actually understand. I've spent enough of my life navigating things at an angle. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, that's going to be a difficult conversation. Most honest ones are. He looked at her with that direct, contained attention that had unmade her composure at a Portland reception and had apparently not lost any of its efficacy in the intervening months. I can do difficult. I've been doing it since September. Outside Vancouver moved through its evening with cheerful indifference to the two people standing at a hotel window negotiating the architecture of a future neither of them had planned. The rain had stopped. The streetlights threw yellow against the wet pavement. Somewhere in Mara's body, the baby Cole's baby, the fact of which was still recalibrating the air in the room, shifted with the small, insistent gravity of something that had already decided it was real. She thought about running. She was honest enough to admit she thought about it calculated. It measured the distance between this window and a life she could construct alone without the complexity of this particular man in it. She thought about it for about 4 seconds. Then she turned from the window and said, "All right, let's start with the honest accounting." And Cole Vanthorpe, who had built an empire on not being readable, allowed her to see very clearly the specific quality of relief in his face. They talked until past midnight. Not the careful circling of people protecting themselves, but the blunter, harder conversation of two people who had decided the protection wasn't worth the cost anymore. Cole told her things she suspected, things she hadn't known, and things that were harder to hear than either. She told him what she'd done, what she'd found, and what she'd chosen not to do with it. They sat across from each other at the hotel table with the city going quiet outside the meal, long finished, neither of them making any moves toward anything that wasn't the work of being known. By the end of it, she understood him better than she had when she'd thought she loved him, which she was fairly certain she still did, and that was a problem, and also possibly the beginning of something. "I need to go home," she said finally. "To my apartment." "I know." He stood when she stood because he'd always had that particular courtesy. "Can I call tomorrow?" "Yeah. Yes, yes." She picked up her coat. "Cole." "Yeah." "I'm not saying yes to everything. I'm saying yes to the conversation." She met his eyes. "Don't mistake that." "I won't." He said it with a steadiness that was different from his usual control, less defended, more deliberate. "I've learned the difference." She left him standing in the middle of that hotel suite with the Vancouver night behind him and walked back out into the cool air of a city that had started to feel tentatively and with full knowledge of its own contingency, like somewhere she belonged. The baby kicked for the first time that night, a soft, barely there flutter so faint she almost dismissed it as imagination. She stopped on the sidewalk in the dark and pressed her hand to her stomach and stood absolutely still, waiting. It came again, small and unmistakable. "All right," she said very quietly to the living thing inside her that had already started deciding the shape of her future. "Right." She walked home through the clean, wet streets of East Vancouver and didn't look back, and for the first time in 4 months didn't feel the need to. That night, Mara lay in her narrow bed in East Vancouver, listening to the rain resume against the window, and ran through the conversation at the Hotel Georgia the same way she'd been trained to debrief a field operation methodically, without sentimentality, cataloging what had been said and what had been implied and what had been carefully not said. It was a habit that had served her well in federal work and served her poorly in everything else, because it presupposed that human interaction could be accurately mapped if you applied sufficient rigor to the exercise. It couldn't. Cole had proven that from the first night. What she kept returning to was not what he'd told her about the restructuring, though that was significant and she'd sit with it separately, but the thing he hadn't explained: the 4 months. He'd known or suspected for 4 months. He'd left a book outside her door and then waited. Most men of Cole's resources and disposition would not have waited. They would have arrived. They would have made themselves known in ways that foreclosed options. The waiting was a deliberate choice, and deliberate choices in Cole's behavioral repertoire were never casual. He was trying to tell her something with the waiting that he couldn't quite say directly. She thought about it until she fell asleep, and thought about it again when she woke at 6 to the baby's now reliable morning announcement of displeasure at the concept of an empty stomach. She called Rebecca Cho the next morning. Rebecca was an attorney she'd met through a mutual contact at the Vancouver financial services firm Family Law, primarily meticulous, not easily impressed, and crucially not connected to anyone in Cole Vanthorpe's professional orbit. Mara explained the situation in the careful, fact-organized way she'd been trained to brief people: the relationship, the pregnancy, the conversation of the previous night, the proposal for a negotiated co-parenting agreement. Rebecca listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, she said, "What's your primary concern?" "Autonomy," Mara said. "That any agreement we reach doesn't become a mechanism for control. That I'm not trading one complicated situation for a legally codified version of the same thing. And what are you willing to offer? Consistent access, real involvement in the child's life, transparency about major decisions. I'm not trying to cut him out. I'm trying to make sure I'm not cut out of my own." "That's a workable framework," Rebecca said. "Send me whatever he proposes before you agree to anything. And Mara, don't let the emotional weight of the situation accelerate the timeline. You have time. Use it." She said she would. She mostly believed herself. Cole called at 10 as he'd asked to. The conversation was shorter than the night before, practical, rather than revelatory, the two of them establishing rhythms that didn't exist yet. He was still in Vancouver. He asked if he could come by. She said she wasn't ready for him to know where she lived, not yet, not until there was something structural in place that made the knowing feel safe, rather than exposing. He said he understood. He didn't sound hurt by it, which she respected. He asked about the baby instead. Practical questions, the kind that suggested he'd been doing research, what week she was in, whether she was seeing a doctor regularly, whether there was anything she needed that she wasn't getting. She answered honestly, which was that everything was medically fine, and she was managing, which was mostly true and partially a matter of definitional flexibility around the word managing. "What do you want to know?" she asked, because the careful questions felt like circling. A pause. "Everything. But I'm trying to pace myself." "Pace yourself faster. I'm not fragile." "I know you're not fragile." His voice had a texture she remembered from the quieter moments of their time together, the register he used when he was being specific about something. "I saw those first edition prints you have stacked by the window in your apartment, the ones on fluvial geomorphology." Mara stopped walking. She'd been pacing her room, which she did when she talked on the phone, a habit she'd never broken. "You've seen my apartment. I needed to know you were safe. I didn't go inside. I want to be clear that I wasn't surveilling you. I looked once from the street to confirm you were in a place that seemed secure. Then I left." "Cole." "I know. That's the exact kind of behavior we can't." "I know." His voice was flat with self-awareness. "It was wrong. I'm telling you about it because I said no more omissions, not because I think it was acceptable." She stood in the middle of her apartment and thought about the difference between those two things, the doing of it and the telling of it, and tried to weigh them with accuracy. He was right that the telling mattered. He was also right that the doing had been wrong. Both of those things were simultaneously true, and she was going to have to get comfortable with that kind of simultaneity if she was going to navigate anything with this man. "Don't do it again," she said. "I won't. If you want to know I'm safe, ask me. I'll tell you."
All right.
"And I want that in writing, along with everything else." "Rebecca Cho," he said. "I ran her credentials this morning. She's excellent. I'll have my attorneys work with her directly." Mara absorbed that. "You knew I'd find my own representation. You'd have been foolish not to, and you're not foolish." A beat. "One of the first things I noticed about you." "What was the first thing?" He was quiet for a moment. "That you came to that reception alone and weren't looking for company, but you also weren't closed to it. That's a specific quality. Most people are one or the other." She sat down on her bed. The baby moved a flutter that was becoming more consistent, more identifiable as its own particular vocabulary. "Cole, what happens if we negotiate all of this in good faith, and then something from your business history surfaces and creates legal complications? I'm not asking to threaten you. I'm asking because I need to plan around realistic contingencies." He took the question seriously as she'd known he would. "Then those complications belong to me, not to you. You left that investigation. You had no continuing obligation, and you made choices that any objective review would classify as appropriate given the circumstances. Whatever accountability I have for the past is mine to carry." A pause. "I'm not asking you to share it, but our child will share your name. If that becomes a complicated name, the restructuring is real, Mara. I'm not performing reform for your benefit. I started it before I knew you'd left Vancouver the first time." His voice was measured but carrying weight. "I made decisions in the past that I knew were wrong, and I rationalized because the alternative seemed like dismantling something I'd spent 20 years building. And then one morning, I woke up in an estate overlooking the Columbia River and tried to imagine explaining those decisions to someone He stopped. Started again. "To someone whose judgment I respected. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't construct the argument. That was the morning I started making different choices." She wanted to ask who that someone was. She was fairly sure she knew. "I'll read whatever the attorneys produce," she said instead. "And I'll have Rebecca go through it with forensic care. If it's honest, we'll sign it. And after we sign it, we figure out what the rest looks like. One thing at a time." "One thing at a time," he agreed. "Mara." "Yeah. Thank you for not disappearing further." She thought about the book left outside her door, the 3 words, "The 4 months of waiting." "Thank you for not pursuing harder," she said. "That's the thing I'll remember." When she hung up, she sat for a while in the room's comfortable anonymity and let herself acknowledge something she'd been holding at a careful arm's length for 4 months, that she had not run to escape him. Not entirely. She'd run because everything between them had been built on a structural fault she hadn't known how to address without first creating distance enough to think clearly. The fault was still there, but there was also the baby and the book and the 3 words and the fact that a man with every resource available to compel a different outcome had chosen to wait. That was data. She was trained to use data. She went to her desk, opened her laptop, and began drafting her list of non-negotiables. The attorneys met that Thursday. Rebecca on Mara's behalf, 2 members of Cole's legal team operating under what they described as new compliance frameworks, which Mara noted with careful neutrality and did not comment on. The initial draft agreement arrived by Friday afternoon. She and Rebecca spent 4 hours on it that evening, going through every clause with the methodical rigor of 2 women who understood that document architecture mattered, that the language of agreements shaped the reality they governed. "It's more generous than I expected," Rebecca said at one point, setting down her coffee. "The autonomy provisions specifically. He's not trying to limit your mobility. He's not building in approval mechanisms for your personal decisions. The security provisions are framed as optional. Optional with strong language recommending I accept them, which is not the same as mandatory." Rebecca tapped the page. "He could have made them mandatory. Men in his position typically do when they have the leverage. He didn't." Mara looked at the clause in question. It gave Cole the right to offer security resources, but explicitly stated that their acceptance was at her discretion and that refusal would not affect any other terms of the agreement. It was, she had to admit, a more careful piece of drafting than she'd anticipated. "What does that tell you?" Rebecca asked. "That either his attorneys are very good or he's thought seriously about what I would find acceptable and drafted accordingly." In my experience with men like Cole Vanthorpe, Rebecca said, it's usually the latter when the document has this quality of attention. Attorneys produce structure. The specific choices within that structure come from the client. Mara set the document down and looked out the window at the evening rain on Robson Street. He's trying, she said more to herself than to Rebecca. He is, Rebecca agreed. The question is whether trying is enough. It's a start. Is it enough for you? Mara thought about the baby, about the flutter that came every morning now like a greeting, increasingly insistent, increasingly specific, as if the person inside her was developing opinions. About the conversation at the hotel that had lasted until midnight and had not felt even in its most difficult passages like a negotiation between adversaries. About the fact that she was someone who made decisions based on evidence, and she had evidence. It's enough to move forward on, she said. We'll see what forward looks like. They sent their revisions on Saturday morning. Cole accepted every substantive one without counter-argument, which was either a sign of genuine good faith or extraordinary strategic patience, and she could not even with all her training determine which with certainty. She accepted that uncertainty. She was learning to. The agreement was signed the following Tuesday in Rebecca's downtown office. Both parties present the Vancouver Rain making its usual gray commentary on proceedings that didn't require its input. Cole wore a jacket she'd never seen before, darker, quieter. Nothing like the commanding suits of the conference rooms she'd once documented from a distance. He looked, she thought, like a man who was trying to dress like someone who was actually changing rather than someone performing it. The distinction was fine, and she noted it precisely. When the signatures were complete, Rebecca stepped out to file the documents, and they were left briefly alone with the fact of what they'd just done. How do you feel? Cole asked. Like I've signed a lot of documents in the past year, and none of them have quite prepared me for this one. She looked at the copy in her hands. Like this is real in a way the other things weren't. It is real. I know. She set this document down. Cole, I have to tell you something that I should have said at the Hotel Georgia and didn't because I was still working up to it. He waited. When I was assigned to your case 3 years ago, I believed you were guilty. The financial architecture suggested intent. It was elegant in ways that aren't usually accidental. She met his eyes. I still don't know with certainty whether what was built by you or around you. And I'm telling you that because you said no omissions, and that's a real one. I went in believing you were a certain kind of person, and I'm still not entirely sure what kind of person you are. The silence was long enough that she started cataloging exit routes from the room. Then he said, I know. You know that you're still uncertain. I know that you're telling me because it's honest and because you think I deserve to know the shape of your doubt. You're right. I do. He leaned back slightly. For what it's worth, the things I was involved in were decisions I made, not things done to me or around me. I was the architect. I'm not going to let you continue not knowing that and feel like I got something from you under false pretenses. The admission landed with a weight she'd expected but still felt. Okay, she said carefully. Okay? I'm not a prosecutor anymore, Cole. What you just told me, I know what to do with it as a piece of personal truth, and I know what not to do with it as someone who left that case 3 years ago. She held his gaze. It matters that you told me. It matters that you didn't let me keep not knowing. That's the thing I can use. Use how? To trust the trajectory, she said. Not the history, the direction. Something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but contained elements of both. The trajectory is the only thing I have to offer. Then offer it consistently. She stood gathering her copy of the agreement. I'll see you on Thursday. You have an appointment with me and my prenatal OB who has opinions about fathers who aren't present for appointments and has expressed them clearly enough that I thought I should warn you. The almost smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. I'll be there. 8 o'clock. Don't be impressive about it. Just be there. She left him in the office with the Vancouver afternoon falling away through the windows behind him and walked out into the city that was becoming hers, carrying the child that was becoming theirs, toward a future that was for the first time in a very long time, genuinely uncertain, in a way that felt like possibility rather than threat. The baby moved as she pushed through the door, a decisive little kick in the vicinity of her ribs, as if registering an opinion. I know, Mara said under her breath. I think so too. Cole Vanthorpe arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. Mara noted this with the part of her brain that still reflexively timed things, still cataloged behaviors for what they revealed. He did not arrive at 7:55, which would have suggested anxiety. He did not arrive at 8:04, which would have suggested dominance through lateness. He came at exactly the appointed moment, in the same quiet jacket, holding 2 coffees from the place around the corner from the clinic. One regular one, the decaf she'd mentioned in passing during their phone call 3 days ago, that she'd switched to because the baby had made its position on caffeine abundantly clear. She took the decaf without comment. He read that correctly as acknowledgement rather than gratitude. The OB's name was Dr. Patricia Suen, and she had the specific energy of someone who had spent 20 years watching people navigate the most vulnerable moments of their lives and had emerged from the experience not with detachment, but with a precision of compassion, direct, unromantic, entirely on the patient's side. She shook Cole's hand when Mara introduced him, assessed him with the frank efficiency of someone who'd seen every variation of this particular scenario, and turned back to Mara. Standard 20-week anatomy scan today, she said. We'll be checking everything. Do you want to know the sex? Mara and Cole answered simultaneously. She said no, and he said, whatever you want. And Dr. Suen raised an eyebrow at the harmony of that and moved on professionally. The scan was the most interior silence Mara had experienced in recent memory. She lay on the table with the cold gel and the transducer, and on the screen the baby appeared. Not the abstract cellular fact she'd been carrying in her head for 5 months, but a specific, detailed, opinionated-looking small person with a nose she immediately recognized and hands that were currently covering its face with the evident intention of remaining private about it. Cole stood at the edge of her peripheral vision. She didn't look at him. She looked at the screen. Heartbeat is excellent, Dr. Suen said. Growth is on track. Everything I'm seeing is exactly where it should be. A pause. Your baby has decided not to cooperate with a particular view I need, so we may be here a few extra minutes. Sounds familiar, Cole said quietly, and it was so specifically accurate a thing to say that Mara made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied the same general territory. The scan took 35 minutes in total. When it was done and they were back in the hallway with their respective copies of the images, Cole held his carefully, the way he'd held Isabella. She corrected herself internally, the way he'd held the coffee like something he didn't want to break. The mental slip surprised her. She filed it away. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Do you feel ready for this? He gestured vaguely, the gesture encompassing the clinic, the images, all of it. Because I'm deeply and specifically not ready, and I'm trying to determine whether that's a personal failure or a universal condition. It's universal. I think readiness is retrospective. You only know you were ready once you've already done it. That's not comforting. No, and you're fine with that. She considered the question honestly. I've spent the last 4 years working in contexts where the full picture was never available before I had to act. I've gotten comfortable operating with incomplete information. This is just a more permanent version of that. Cole looked at the scan image in his hands. Is that what she is, incomplete information? Mara stopped walking. Did you say she? He looked up quickly. No. I said I didn't mean anything by that. It was pronoun default. She studied his face. He was not lying exactly, but he was not entirely truthful about his certainty. Cole, I have no information about the sex of our child, he said with the careful precision of someone choosing words over meaning. None. She decided to table it. We'll have lunch, she said, and you can tell me what's actually happening with the restructuring because I asked for that accounting and you've been broadly gesturing at it for 2 weeks. Lunch was at a restaurant on Granville Island that Mara had found in her first week in Vancouver. Not expensive, not trying to be with windows overlooking False Creek and a kitchen that took its fish seriously. Cole looked slightly at odds with his surroundings in the way that people with substantial resources sometimes did in deliberately unpretentious places, not out of snobbery but out of sheer unfamiliarity. She'd once noted that quality in him as charming. She still found it charming, which she was not going to tell him. He laid out the restructuring in the organized, unsentimental manner of someone who had rehearsed the telling enough to do it without evasion, but had not yet found a way to do it without cost. The shell corporations were being dissolved. The bribery networks, and he used that word bribery without the softening vocabulary that people usually reached for, were being unwound through settlements with parties who had been harmed in amounts that had been negotiated with the guidance of attorneys who understood both the legal exposure and the ethical dimension. The port contracts that had been corruptly obtained were being submitted for review. In 2 cases, he'd already initiated the return of contracts to competitors who had lost them through his interference. That's significant money, Mara said. Yes, the port contracts specifically. You didn't have to do that. There's no legal mechanism compelling you to return them. There's no legal mechanism. That's not the only kind. He looked out at the creek. I had a conversation about 8 months ago with a man named Tom Whelan. He ran one of the competing firms that lost its operating license because of arrangements I made. He lost his license, lost the company, lost most of what he'd spent 15 years building. A pause. I went to see him. Not through attorneys, not through intermediaries. I went myself and told him what had happened and why, and what I intended to do about it. Mara was still. How did that go? He threw me out of his office. A brief, humorless sound. Correctly. And then I had everything documented and sent to his attorney anyway, along with an offer of restitution that was significantly more than legally required. He took 3 weeks to respond. Cole's jaw was tight. He accepted. He said, and this is not the response I was expecting, that what mattered to him was that I understood what I'd done. That accountability isn't real if it stops at the financial transaction. He's right. I know he's right. I've thought about it almost every day since. Cole turned back to her. I'm not telling you this to perform conscience. I'm telling you because you asked for the honest accounting, and the honest accounting includes the parts that are difficult to say out loud. Mara sat with the information for a moment, sorting it. The federal case, she said carefully, the one I was part of. Where does the evidence sit now? My attorneys are in conversations with the relevant authorities. I'm cooperating. His voice was level. It's going to have consequences. I don't know yet exactly what shape they take. That depends on what cooperation produces and how it's received. But I'm not trying to escape accountability. I'm trying to face it in an organized way. Could you go to prison? The word hung there with all its specific weight. I don't know, he said. Cooperating helps. What I'm returning helps. Whether it's enough? He stopped. I want you to know that regardless of what happens legally, the provisions I've put in place for you and the baby are independent of my personal legal situation. Rebecca has all the relevant documents. You and the child will be protected whatever happens to me. Mara felt something shift in her chest, a complicated movement she didn't immediately categorize. That's why the agreement was structured the way it was. Partly, I wanted it to stand on its own, not dependent on my continued freedom of movement. She looked at the man across from her. The careful jacket, the scan image, she'd seen him fold into his interior pocket with a precision that was really just trying not to crease it. The controlled steadiness of someone managing an enormous amount of internal weather. She thought about the version of this man she'd been briefed on 3 years ago. Powerful, strategic, the architect of schemes that had hurt real people. She thought about Tom Whelan throwing him out of an office. She thought about the fact that Cole had taken the rejection, and had sent the documents anyway. I'm not going to pretend this is simple, she said. I know. What you've done in the past, it's not absolved by the present corrective actions. People were harmed. I know that too, and I'm not the right person to grant or withhold forgiveness on their behalf. That's not mine to give. I'm not asking you for it. He met her eyes directly. I'm asking you to let me be someone who's accountable, someone who's changed direction. I'm not asking you to pretend the turn didn't happen. Just, he paused. Acknowledge the direction. She thought about what Rebecca had said, the trajectory. She thought about what she'd said to Cole himself, offer it consistently. I'm acknowledging it, she said. It doesn't resolve everything, but it's the right direction. Something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not relief exactly, but the subtle release of something long held. That's enough. For now. Don't make it more than it is, she said, not unkindly. We're building something fragile here. We both have to know that. Fragile things can last if you're careful with them, or careful about them. There's a difference. He almost smiled. You're very precise. It's either a professional asset or a personality defect, depending on context. In this context, he said, it's exactly what's needed. They walked along the seawall after lunch, the harbor busy with October marine traffic, the mountains across the water dusted with the first high-elevation snow of the season. Mara's pace had adjusted in recent weeks to accommodate the changed geometry of her body, and Cole matched it without comment or condescension, which she also noted in the way she noted the coffee and the 8 o'clock and the careful jacket. She was building a file. It was different from the kind of file she used to build on him. She wasn't entirely sure yet what it was for. I've been thinking, she said, about what this looks like, practically. You have an estate in Oregon. I have an apartment here. The baby is going to be born in Vancouver. Yes. I'm not moving to the estate. I know. I've been looking at properties here. He said it matter-of-factly. The business can be managed from Vancouver. Most of the active operations are coastal anyway. I've been considering the move for a while. Mara stopped walking. You're moving to Vancouver. If that works for you, I don't want to be a long-distance parent. I don't want to see my child on scheduled visits across an international border. I want to be... He paused, choosing the word carefully. Present, in the daily sense. You've already been looking at properties. I've been in Vancouver for 3 weeks. He looked at her without apology. I wasn't going to say anything until the agreement was signed, but yes. She processed this. You need to tell me these things when you're doing them, not after. You're right. I don't want to discover that you've made significant decisions that affect our shared situation without... You're right, Mara. He said it without defensiveness. I defaulted to acting and disclosing later. It's a pattern I'm working on. She started walking again. He fell back into step. Is there anything else you've decided that I should know about? I've registered Isabella. I've registered the baby. He stopped. Tried again. I've started the paperwork for establishing Canadian residency. How long have you been working on that? 6 weeks. She let the silence do the work for a moment. I understand that looks like a lot of moving parts you weren't told about, he said. I want to explain the thinking, not justify the approach. Explain it. I knew from the night at the hotel that you were going to need time before you were ready for any of this. I also knew that the practical infrastructure, the property, the residency, the business restructuring would take time to establish. So I started establishing it while you were taking the time you needed, not to present you with a fait accompli, so that when you were ready to discuss it, there would be actual options rather than abstract intentions. Mara walked. The water was very blue. A container ship was making its way under the Lions Gate Bridge with the slow dignity of something that weighed more than most buildings. That's very Cole, she said finally. Is that good or bad? It's characteristic. She glanced at him. It means you need to work harder on the disclosing part. Preparation is fine. Secrecy isn't. Agreed. I mean it. I know you mean it. He stopped walking and turned to face her, which forced her to stop too. I'm not perfect at this. I'm not going to be perfect at this. I'm going to make choices that you'd have wanted input on, and I'm going to have to correct them, and that's going to require patience from both of us. But I want you to know. He paused, and the controlled exterior gave way briefly to something more specific. I want you to know that every decision I've made since September has been made with you and this baby at the center of it. Not as variables to be managed, as... He searched for the right word. As the point. The point, she repeated, of the direction I'm traveling. He looked at her steadily. You asked me to offer it consistently. I'm trying. She studied him. The patience in his face, the effort it represented, the specific quality of a man who is accustomed to certainty, learning to stand in the middle of not knowing and not retreat from it. Buy the property, she said, but I want to see it before you finalize anything. The relief was visible this time. Of course. And Cole, yes? If you've already identified the specific property you want, you can just tell me that. He looked at her for a moment. Then, it's on Dunbar Street. 4 bedrooms. Good school catchment. 15 minutes from the clinic. When did you put in an offer? I haven't. I wanted your input first. He paused. That part is genuinely true. She believed him. That was the complicated thing about all of it, that the line between Cole's overreach and his care was so fine, so genuinely blurry, that she had to keep measuring it with precision rather than dismissing it wholesale in either direction. Send me the listing, she said. We'll look at it this weekend. The days that followed developed their own careful rhythm. Not domesticity, not yet, but the early architecture of something that might eventually become it. Cole had taken a suite at the Rosewood Hotel while the Dunbar Street house went through its final paperwork, and they fell into a pattern of 2 or 3 meetings a week, sometimes at the prenatal clinic, sometimes over food. Once at the property itself, where they stood in the empty living room with its view of mature oaks, and the agent hovering in what she clearly imagined was a discreet distance. The kitchen is too small, Mara said. I'll have it expanded before we move in. You're moving in? He looked at her. I meant before the baby moves in. Presumably with you. A pause. Although I hadn't assumed. Are you planning to be here? I live in East Vancouver, which is not Dunbar Street. She looked at the kitchen, at the oaks through the window, at the light which was exactly the kind of morning light she'd told the estate manager she'd found lacking at Cole's Oregon property. Though Cole hadn't known she'd said that because it had been to a staff member who'd simply noted it in a file that Cole had read exactly once and apparently retained. The kitchen needs to be expanded, she said. And the second bedroom needs a separate entrance if it's going to be a nursery. Cole said nothing. He was careful not to say anything. But when she glanced over, she found the expression on his face very briefly before he assembled it back into neutrality that suggested he'd understood everything she'd just communicated without using any of the words she hadn't been ready for. Good, she thought. He was learning to read what she wasn't saying. That was different from the way he'd read her when they first met, less about locating the edges of her defenses and more about understanding what she meant when she trusted him enough to be indirect. It was, she thought, progress. The house was finalized on a Thursday. The kitchen renovation began the following Monday. The nursery was the second room, completed, done in a color that was not pink and not blue, but a deep eucalyptus green that Mara had selected from a sample book at the paint store on West Broadway. While Cole stood beside her holding paint chips with the focused gravity of someone who understood that this mattered and didn't understand why it mattered in the specific way it did, which she found oddly endearing. They painted it together. This was not planned. The painter arrived and explained that the ventilation situation in that particular room made it inadvisable for a pregnant person to be present during the application, at which point Mara made clear that she would be supervising the color match personally and would be wearing a proper mask. And Cole made clear that in that case, he would also be painting because 2 sets of eyes were better than 1 for color accuracy, and the painter stood between them for a moment and then quietly handed them each a roller and took his lunch break. They painted the nursery themselves. Neither of them mentioned what it meant. November arrived with the particular earnestness of Vancouver. Autumn persistent rain. The kind that didn't perform at itself, but simply existed, and the early dusk that compressed the days into something intimate and interior. Mara was 22 weeks, and the baby had developed a personality of sufficient assertiveness that she'd begun to feel it as a specific presence, rather than a general condition opinionated about positions insistent at particular hours. Evidently enthusiastic about percussion, given its response to the music she played while she worked. Cole came to the Dunbar house most evenings. This had not been negotiated. It had simply happened he'd come to help with something on the second evening after possession and then come again the following evening because there were still boxes, and then the evening after that with food because the kitchen was not yet fully functional, and by the 4th evening it was simply a pattern, the kind that establishes itself before you think to examine whether you intended it. She examined it on the 5th evening while he was making something with the equipment they'd managed to get operational, and she was sitting at the kitchen island reading, and the rain was doing its reliable thing outside, and the baby was doing its reliable thing inside, and the room was warm and improbably easy in the way that rooms sometimes became when you stopped fighting what they wanted to be. "This has become a thing," she said. "Has it? You coming in the evenings? I bring food." He didn't turn from the stove. The refrigerator situation was alarming. "It's been fully stocked for a week." "You're 22 weeks pregnant. One is never fully stocked enough." Mara looked at the back of his head. "Are you going to keep coming?" He turned then. The kitchen smelled like garlic, and something she had an unreasonable craving for that she'd managed not to mention aloud, but which she was fairly certain he'd somehow identified because it was in the pan. "Do you want me to keep coming?" She thought about the honest answer. "Yes," she said. "That's what concerns me." "Why does it concern you?" "Because it means I'm getting comfortable, and comfortable has historically been how I miss things." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to the stove. "What you missed before," he said, choosing his words with care, wasn't a product of being comfortable. It was a product of not having full information. You were operating under conditions that were deliberately obscured. He paused. "You have full information now, or as close to it as either of us can manage. Comfortable and informed is different from comfortable and blind." She looked at the rain on the window. "That's a fine distinction. You make fine distinctions professionally. You can make them personally, too. It's harder personally." "I know." He was plating something now, the economical movements of someone who'd learned to cook in kitchens where efficiency mattered. The things that matter usually are. He set a plate in front of her. It was exactly what she'd been craving. She looked at it for a moment and then looked at him. "How did you know?" "You paused in front of a restaurant window on Dunbar last Tuesday for approximately 4 seconds. You do that when something catches your attention. You then walked on without going in, which means you'd talked yourself out of it." He sat across from her. "The same way you talked yourself out of the coffee on West 4th the other week and the pastry at the Saturday market. You've been cataloging my restraint. I've been paying attention. He met her eyes without apology. That's what I do when something matters to me. You've known that from the beginning. She had known it. It was one of the things she'd found most disorienting about him from the first night, the quality of his attention, the way it felt like being genuinely seen in a world where being looked at and being seen were entirely different things. She'd filed it originally under things to be cautious about. It was still there in that file, but the file had gotten more complicated. Thank you, she said, for dinner. You're welcome. He picked up his fork. For what it's worth, I'm getting comfortable too. She looked at him. It also concerns me, he said, for different reasons. But I've decided the concern is worth it. A pause. You can decide the same thing at your own pace. She ate her dinner. Outside, Vancouver went on with its evening in that reliable, unimpressed way of cities that have seen enough to know that any given moment is just a moment. The baby moved decisive and present, and Mara thought about comfort and information and the various ways that knowing someone could be used for and against you, and concluded, as she had been slowly concluding for weeks, that the person across the table from her was trying with a specificity and consistency that she hadn't fully let herself acknowledge. She wasn't ready to say that aloud. She was aware of the moment she'd be ready, the way she was aware of most things as a future data point approaching. But she ate the dinner he'd made because he'd paid enough attention to make it right, and she let the evening be easy, and those were their own kinds of saying. The first complication arrived on a Wednesday morning in the form of a phone call from a number Mara didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She'd built careful habits around unfamiliar contact, a leftover from 4 years of undercover work, and the habit persisted the way all deeply trained behaviors persisted below the level of thought in the body. But she answered it. Ms. Sinclair. The voice was male professional, carrying the specific quality of someone accustomed to delivering information that other people would rather not receive. My name is David Lorne. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division in Portland. I understand you were previously affiliated with our Vancouver field contact under a different designation. I'm reaching out because your name has appeared in connection with an ongoing matter, and I wanted to make contact before you heard about it through other channels. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. She kept her voice even. Go ahead. We've been in contact with Cole Vanthorpe's legal team regarding his cooperation with our investigation. In the course of reviewing documentation related to your reassignment, certain questions have arisen about whether your departure from the case constituted a conflict of interest that may have affected the investigation's progress. A pause. I want to be clear you're not under investigation, but we may need to speak with you regarding the timeline and nature of your reassignment. After she hung up, Mara sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she called Rebecca. Tell me exactly what they said, Rebecca said when Mara had recounted it. She told her exactly. The reassignment was by the book, Rebecca asked. Completely. I reported the conflict, requested the reassignment. It was approved. There's documentation of all of it. Did you disclose the nature of the conflict? Mara paused. I described it as a personal involvement with a subject adjacent to the investigation. Cole specifically, I didn't name him. It was a personal conflict with someone connected to the investigation. That's what I said. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. That's technically accurate, but not complete. I know. Which means if they press for specifics, I'll have to be more specific. Mara stood and moved to the window. The November rain was heavy today, the kind that turned the backyard oaks into dark shapes against a pale sky. I'm not going to lie to federal investigators. That's not a path I'm willing to go down. You're not being asked to lie. But you should know that full disclosure will make it explicit that you were in a personal relationship with the target of your investigation while you were on that case. I know what it will make explicit. And Cole needs to know about this call, Rebecca said. Today. I know that too. Mara? Rebecca's voice was careful. How are you feeling about it? She considered the question. The baby was quiet this morning, the morning stillness that sometimes followed the active nights. Outside, a crow landed on the oak branch nearest the window, examined something on the ground with professional interest, and departed. I'm not spiraling, she said. If that's what you're asking. It's not what I was asking. She searched for the accurate word. Tired of things from the past having purchase in the present, but that's not a feeling I'm going to let make decisions for me. Good. Rebecca paused. Call Cole. She called Cole. He answered on the second ring. She told him everything in order without editorializing. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence on his end had a specific quality that she'd learned to read. Not anger, not panic, but the controlled gathering of resources that was his response to serious information. "This is connected to my cooperation," he said. "Almost certainly. Someone is trying to complicate my cooperation by raising questions about your reassignment." "That's one reading. What's the other reading?" "That it's a legitimate procedural inquiry and we're both just going to have to cooperate with it." She sat on the edge of her bed. "Cole, what you need to understand is that I'm going to tell them the truth. Everything I know. I'm not going to manage my disclosure to protect you or to protect myself. The reassignment was appropriate, but I wasn't fully explicit about why. I'm going to be fully explicit now. That could create problems for you." "I know." "The personal involvement, I know what it looks like. It looks like I compromised the investigation by developing a relationship with someone connected to the target while I was actively on the case. That's what it is. I can argue the timeline and the appropriateness of my response, but I can't change what happened." She paused. "I don't want to change it. Even knowing everything I know now." He was quiet for a long moment. "Mara." "Don't!" "I was going to say—" "I know what you were going to say. Don't say it yet." She was not ready for what he was going to say, could feel the shape of it from 3 sentences away, and was very specifically not ready for it in the middle of a crisis moment where she needed to be able to think. "Right now I need to focus on the inquiry. Everything else is a conversation for when this is handled." He pulled back. She could feel him pull back the restraint of it. "Tell me what you need." "I need Rebecca to speak to your attorneys. I need full access to any documentation related to your cooperation timeline that's relevant to my reassignment question. And I need you to be honest with me about whether you were aware that your cooperation might surface questions about me." Another pause. "I considered the possibility. And I told my attorneys that under no circumstances was anything related to your situation to be used strategically, that your cooperation or non-cooperation with investigators was entirely your own choice and not to be influenced by anything connected to me." His voice was steady, but carrying effort. "I can have that instruction documented if you'd like to see it." She believed him, which did not entirely resolve the situation but resolved the part that mattered most in this moment. "Send it to Rebecca. It'll be there within the hour." "Cole." "Yeah. Thank you for the instruction to your attorneys." She paused. "That was the right call." "I'm trying," he said, and she could hear in those 2 words the weight of everything they both knew that meant. Not just this morning, the whole direction. "I know you are," she said. The meeting with the federal investigator was scheduled for the following week. Rebecca spent 3 days preparing Mara for it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the preparation was not about deception, but about precision. Knowing exactly what you'd done and exactly why, being able to articulate the distinction between what was professionally appropriate and what was personally regrettable, presenting the full picture without either defensive minimization or unnecessary escalation. On the morning of the interview, Mara woke at 5, which was earlier than usual, even for the baby's most enthusiastic periods. She lay in the Dunbar Street bedroom, her bedroom the one she'd chosen partly for its light, and partly because it faced the Oaks and ran through the relevant facts the way she'd always run through them, before something significant methodically without ornamentation. She had met Cole Vanthorpe at a professional function while undercover. She had developed a personal connection. She had recognized at the point when that connection became something she could no longer classify as purely operational that she had a conflict. She had reported that conflict to her supervisor through appropriate channels, requested reassignment, and been reassigned. She had not shared confidential case information with Cole. She had not taken any action that benefited or harmed the investigation subsequent to her reassignment. The investigation had continued under different personnel. Those were the facts. The fact that she was carrying his child, that she was living in a house on Dunbar Street with oaks in the backyard, and a nursery-painted eucalyptus green that she was building something with him that she had not yet named. None of that was part of the professional history. None of it changed the professional history. They were parallel truths, and she was going to be precise about keeping them parallel. The interview took 2 hours. David Lorne was, as he'd sounded on the phone, professional and thorough. He asked precise questions and received precise answers. Rebecca was present throughout and intervened exactly twice, both times on procedural grounds that were legitimate. Mara answered what she was asked and did not volunteer what she wasn't asked, which was not the same as evasion, and she made sure Lorne understood the distinction. When it was over, Rebecca walked with her to the elevator. That was clean, she said. It was honest. Those can be the same thing. Rebecca pressed the button. He's satisfied with the timeline. The reassignment documentation corroborates everything you said. She paused. You might get a follow-up, but I don't think so. The inquiry is going to land where it should. Mara exhaled slowly. The baby, perhaps sensing her relief, chose this moment to deliver a particularly decisive kick. That's you, isn't it? She said, not quite aloud. Rebecca glanced at her with a professionally suppressed smile. I assume that wasn't directed at me. The baby has opinions about good outcomes. Smart baby. The elevator arrived. Go home, Mara. Eat something. Tell Cole it went well. Let someone take care of you for an evening. She went home. Cole was there when she arrived, not at the house, but outside it on the front steps with takeout containers, and the particular careful quality of someone who had been trying to give her space and had managed it for a specific finite and now apparently elapsed period. Rebecca called, he said, which explained it. Rebecca called you. She said I should be here when you got back. He held up the containers. She also said, and I'm quoting, she won't say she needs it, so don't ask. Mara looked at him standing on the front steps of their house. She'd been thinking of it as their house for 2 weeks and hadn't examined when that had happened in the early evening light, with dinner having managed to be present without making it into something she'd have to argue against, and felt something tilt in her chest in a way that was becoming familiar. Rebecca is very good at her job, she said. She is. He moved back to let her open the door. How are you? I'm very specifically not going to answer that yet. She unlocked the door. Ask me after dinner. After dinner, he agreed. They ate in the kitchen, in the particular warmth of the November dusk, the oaks visible through the window going to silhouette, and she told him what she'd said in the interview, and what had been said in return, and what Rebecca's assessment was, and he listened without trying to fix anything, which she noted as a specific act of restraint that she knew had required effort. When she was finished, he said, Lorne is good at his job. If he's satisfied, he's satisfied. I know. You did well. I told the truth, she said. That's not something you do well or badly. It's just what you do. Some people don't. I noticed. She looked at him across the table. Cole, the investigation, your cooperation. How serious is the exposure? He was quiet for a moment. Serious. Meaning I have attorneys who are very good at their jobs, working very hard to find the outcome that reflects both my cooperation and the full extent of what was done. It's possible that outcome includes consequences I'd rather not face. He met her eyes without the armor she'd watched him gradually remove over the past weeks. I'm not going to tell you it'll be fine. I don't know if it'll be fine. What are we talking about concretely? Supervision? Probationary structures. Potentially something more significant, though my attorneys believe cooperation makes the more significant options unlikely. He paused. I wanted to tell you before it becomes public. The resolution is probably 2 to 3 months out. She absorbed this. Will it affect the house, the trust arrangements for the baby? No. Those are independent and protected. Whatever happens to me legally doesn't touch what's set up for you and the baby. I'm not asking about that to protect myself, she said. I'm asking because I need to understand our actual situation. I know. He looked at her. Our actual situation is that I'm a man who made serious mistakes and is working to face the consequences of them honestly, and who is also trying to build something worth building alongside someone who has very good reasons to be cautious about trusting him. He paused. And who has the most alarming prenatal scan images I've ever seen, because they show a real human person I'm apparently responsible for, which is the most frightening and galvanizing thing that has ever happened to me. Mara looked at him across the kitchen table. The baby kicked, which seemed as it sometimes did, like an editorial contribution. Tell me something, she said. When you said in the car that the baby was a girl, was that actually a slip? He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. No. You know, my attorneys were handling certain documents, and one of them included information from the clinic about your prenatal records, which I should not have been sent and which I did not ask for, and which I told them immediately to delete from my files. He paused. I knew for about 48 hours. Then I told myself it was a pronoun default and tried to forget the rest. And I cannot forget the rest. He exhaled. I'm sorry. That was an invasion of your privacy that I didn't initiate but also didn't immediately disclose. Both of those things are true. She sat with this. It sat with her in the complicated way that Cole's better and worse impulses frequently coexisted, the fact that he hadn't asked for it, the fact that he'd tried to limit the damage, The fact that he'd used a pronoun slip to avoid telling her the fact that he was telling her now. "It's a girl," she said. "Yes?" The word settled between them with a weight that was entirely different from every other word in the conversation. A girl. A specific person now. Not a pronoun or a scan image or a tactical consideration in a co-parenting agreement. A girl. "Isabella," Mara said without entirely meaning to. "What?" "Nothing." She shook her head. "Just a name I've been thinking about." Cole was very still. "That was my grandmother's name." "I know." She met his eyes. "I heard you mention her once. It stuck." The silence that followed was the softest thing between them yet. Not the silence of things unsaid, but of something that had just been said without language, and both of them knew it. "Mara," he said, and his voice had that specific quality again. "Not yet," she said quietly. But she let the words sit there, completed with nothing. The completion was understood. He nodded. Outside, the oaks moved in the November dark, and the rain came back to the window where it belonged, and the kitchen was warm with everything that had been said, and a few significant things that hadn't, and the girl, their girl, made herself known inside Mara, with the insistent certainty of someone who already knew exactly who she was. December arrived in Vancouver with the particular ambition of a coastal winter determined to justify its reputation. The rain that had been a fact of life since October now carried an edge, the temperature dropping enough to suggest the mountains weren't merely decorative. The oaks in the back of the Dunbar house held their last leaves in the stoic manner of things that had weathered worse, and Mara spent an increasing number of evenings inside her body, making its own arguments about the appeal of going anywhere unnecessary. She was 26 weeks. The girl was real enough now that she had preferences about position, about sound, about the time of day when she most wanted Mara to be sitting quietly rather than moving around. She seemed to have an opinion about Cole's voice specifically becoming demonstrably active when he was in the room, which Mara chose not to read anything into, but also was not going to pretend she hadn't noticed. He was there most evenings and some mornings. This had not been formally discussed or agreed to. It was simply the shape the days had taken. The inquiry from the Financial Crimes Division closed in the third week of November, as Rebecca had predicted, a procedural notation in Mara's file acknowledging the reassignment as appropriate, her subsequent interview as corroborating the matter as resolved. She learned this via a brief email from Lorne and a slightly longer call from Rebecca, during which neither of them said anything that wasn't entirely professional, and Mara sat at her kitchen desk afterward and felt the specific lightness of a thing that had been sitting on her chest, quietly lifting. Cole's legal situation was less resolved. His cooperation was ongoing, the documentation complex, the timeline measured in months rather than weeks. He'd been transparent about it, more transparent than she'd expected, the accounting arriving in increments as things developed rather than withheld until they were certain. She'd noticed the effort that required of him. She'd noticed that he noticed her noticing. "You're still waiting for me to revert," he said one evening in December, matter-of-factly, not as an accusation. "I'm watching the data," she said. "The data that I keep showing up and telling you things. The data that you keep showing up and telling me things." She looked at him from the armchair she'd developed a proprietary relationship with. "That's not a small data set anymore. What does the data suggest?" She considered this honestly. "That you're committed to the direction. That the direction is genuinely different from the origin point. That the gap between what you say and what you do has gotten very small." She paused. "That I'm running out of ways to be cautious that aren't actually just stubbornness." He was quiet for a moment. "You can be stubborn. I have broad tolerance for it." "I know you do." She shifted in the chair. The girl registering some complaint about the position shifted too. "Cole." "Yeah. When the legal resolution comes, whatever form it takes, I'm not going to leave." The stillness in him was complete. "You don't have to promise that." "I'm not promising. I'm informing. There's a difference." She met his eyes. "You've been operating as if I might disappear again if the situation gets complicated. I'm telling you that the situation being complicated is not what determines whether I stay. What determines it?" "The direction," she said. "We've covered this." He exhaled a slow, controlled breath that she'd come to recognize as his equivalent of something another person might have displayed more openly. "All right, say it back." He looked at her. "The direction determines it, not the situation." "Good." She picked up her book. "You can stop waiting for me to bolt." Something shifted in his face. Not relief, it was beyond that by now, more like a foundation settling. "I've been obvious about that. You've been trying to hide it. That's different from succeeding. He made a sound that in another man might have been a laugh. In Cole, it was something more interior, but it reached his eyes. You notice everything. Notice? Professionally trained to. I haven't figured out how to stop. Don't, he said. I'd rather you see everything than miss something important. She read her book. He read something on his phone and then put the phone down and watched the rain on the window, which was what he did when he was thinking without an object for the thinking yet. She'd mapped his stillnesses the way she'd once mapped everything else about him for different purposes now, but with the same precision. The something important arrived on a Friday evening in the second week of December, and it arrived in the form of a man Mara didn't recognize standing on the front steps of the Dunbar Street house with the specific body language of someone who was not there for anything comfortable. She opened the door before he could knock a second time. Old habit. He was mid-50s, compact, wearing a jacket that was good quality and moderately wet. He had the kind of face that told its history plainly. Not unpleasant, but lived in the features suggesting someone who'd spent significant time in conditions that weren't particularly careful of their impact. Miss Sinclair, he said. My name is Philip Garrett. I used to work for Cole Vanthorpe. He paused. I need to speak with you. I don't want to create a problem. I just need 10 minutes. Mara's hand was on the door, but she didn't close it. She read him his posture, his effect, the specific quality of what he was trying not to perform. Nervousness, yes. But not aggression, not threat. About what? About someone who wants to create a problem, for Mr. Vanthorpe's cooperation, and who may be willing to use you to do it. He held her gaze. My name is on a list of people Cole cooperated against. I'm not on that list because I'm dangerous. I'm on it because I knew things and said the wrong thing to the wrong person. I've been cooperating myself separately, but there's information I couldn't share through official channels, and I thought you should have it directly. She called Cole from the hallway, keeping the front door half open and Garrett visible through the gap. She relayed the situation in 4 sentences. He arrived in 12 minutes. They sat in the kitchen, Garrett at the table, Mara and Cole on the same side of it, which had not been planned but was how they'd arranged themselves instinctively, and which Garrett clocked with a professional eye that suggested he wasn't surprised. Cole recognized him. The recognition was controlled but real a history between them that Mara filed away for later. Garrett said, There's a man named Gregory Strand. He was a senior partner in the compliance consulting firm you used for the port contract arrangements. You know who he is. Cole nodded once. He's been feeding information to someone within the Financial Crimes Division, not through official channels laterally to a specific investigator who's been building a parallel file that's designed to make your cooperation look like damage control rather than genuine disclosure. The goal is to complicate your case before the resolution casts doubt on the credibility of your cooperation timeline. Why, Mara said. Garrett looked at her. Because Strand has significant exposure of his own. If Cole's cooperation is deemed credible and complete, it points in directions that get very uncomfortable for Strand very quickly. He needs Cole's case to become contested, lengthy, uncertain, anything that delays or undermines the findings. He turned back to Cole. He found out about Miss Sinclair's involvement, the historical involvement, the investigation, and he's the one who flagged it to Lorne, not because it was a legitimate inquiry, because he thought it would create noise. The noise had indeed been created, Mara thought. It had simply not produced the results Strand had needed. He's also been in contact with 2 men who used to handle certain logistical aspects of your operations, Garrett continued. Men who are not cooperating with any investigation and who have reason to prefer the current arrangement of things remain unresolved. He paused. I'm not certain what specifically they've been asked to do, but the contact is recent and it's not casual. Cole's expression had the quality she recognized from moments of operational assessment still on the surface, moving very fast underneath. What do you need from me? Nothing from you. I'm telling you because I owed you a cleaner exit than the one I gave you 18 months ago, and this is the closest I can get to it. He glanced at Mara. I'm also telling you because if these individuals decide that Ms. Sinclair is useful to Strand's strategy as a complicating factor given her history with the investigation, you need to be ahead of it. What kind of complicating factor? She said. The kind that could be generated by someone with access to selectively edited documentation and a relationship with a specific investigator. He met her eyes. They can't touch the substance of what you said in your interview, but they could make a noise that follows you professionally, misrepresent the nature of your reassignment, the timing, the reasons. Mara sat with this for a moment. The girl moved, perhaps sensing the spike in temperature in the room. Okay, she said. Cole turned to look at her. She was looking at Garrett. Thank you for coming, she said. I want everything you just told us documented. Names, dates, specifics. I want it in writing, signed with your contact information for follow-up. I'll share it with Rebecca Cho, my attorney, and with Cole's legal team. They'll know what to do with it. Garrett looked at her for a moment. You're a forensic accountant. I was, among other things. That explains the questions in the interview. He nodded. I'll provide the documentation. It's mostly already assembled. He glanced at Cole. I'm sorry it took me this long. After Garrett left, they sat in the kitchen in silence for a moment. The rain had picked up again. The baby was active. Are you all right? Cole said. Yes. She considered. Mostly. I'm angry, which is useful. Useful how? It's a productive affect for what comes next. She pulled out her phone. I'm calling Rebecca. Mara. He put his hand on the table near hers, not touching the gesture, purely spatial. This started with me. With what I built and who I built it with. I know that. I know you know that. She met his eyes. It also started with me making a choice while I was undercover that had consequences I'm still navigating. We're both in the origin story. What matters is where we go from here. She called Rebecca. Rebecca said the words that Rebecca had been saying throughout, focused, precise, oriented toward action. By the end of the call, there was a plan, and plans were things Mara was good at. The documentation from Garrett arrived the following morning. 12 pages, methodical. The product of someone who'd been keeping records as personal insurance long before any of this had arrived at Mara's door. She sent it to Rebecca without comment. Rebecca sent it to Cole's attorneys, who sent it to the relevant supervisory channel in the Financial Crimes Division above Lorne's reporting structure. It took 8 days. The investigator with the parallel file was moved off Cole's case. Gregory Strand's attorney received notice that Strand himself was now a subject of inquiry. The 2 men who'd been in contact with Garrett's list were flagged for monitoring. The machinery of consequence moved with the particular slowness of official processes, which was frustrating and also reassuring in its thoroughness. Cole got a call from his lead attorney on a Tuesday morning in the week before Christmas. He took it in the living room while Mara was at the kitchen desk, and she could hear the shape of the conversation without the specifics, the controlled steadiness of his voice, the single moment of silence that stretched long enough to be significant. The brief reply that she couldn't parse from the kitchen. He came in when the call ended. He stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not precisely this specific combination. Something that was not quite relief and not quite disbelief, but occupied the space between them. What? She said. Cooperation credit, he said. The resolution is a consent decree. Supervised compliance for 3 years, significant financial penalties, the restitution arrangements already in place credited toward them. No incarceration. He paused. My attorney said the documentation from Garrett, the surfacing of Strand, changed the calculus, made the cooperation timeline unambiguous. Mara set down her pen. That's good news. It's very good news. He crossed the kitchen and sat across from her. The consent decree means I can still operate. The business continues the legitimate business. The compliance supervision is external, which is appropriate. He held her gaze. You're looking at me like you're assessing something. I am. She was. How do you feel? Grateful. He said it simply. Accountable. Aware that the outcome I've received is better than I had a right to expect and that the obligation now is to justify it. A pause. Aware that most of why this resolved the way it did is sitting across the kitchen table from me. I just passed along documentation. You've done considerably more than that. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. Mara, I've been trying to find the right moment for something for about 3 weeks, and I've concluded there isn't a right moment, there's just the moment I'm in. She very specifically did not say not yet. I know we haven't named this, he said carefully, what we're doing, what we're building. I know you've needed the time and the data, and I know the legal situation was something you were waiting on. I'm not asking you to resolve anything tonight. I'm asking if you'll allow me to be honest about where I am. She nodded once. I love you, he said. Not as a function of the baby or the situation or what we've been through together. As a fact that was true before any of it and has only gotten more specific since. He paused. That's all I wanted to say. You don't have to respond to it right now. She sat with it. I know, she said finally. He looked at her. I've known for a few weeks, she said. I was waiting for the legal situation to resolve so I could be certain I wasn't conflating my relief with something else. And now that it's resolved, the thing I feel is exactly the same as it was before, which is, she stopped. Cole, I also love you. That's also a fact. I've been less willing to say it out loud because I know what I'm like with facts. I need to verify them before I act on them, and I've been verifying. She met his eyes. I'm done verifying. The silence that followed was entirely different from all the previous silences. It had the quality of something that had been under pressure for a long time, finally being given the shape it needed. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. The baby registered on the moment with her characteristic editorial timing moved. She agrees, Mara said. She always did, Cole said. She's been trying to tell you since September. Mara looked at him, at the man who had been her investigation subject and her personal catastrophe, and the father of her daughter, and the person who had shown up consistently and quietly and without the armor that had made him formidable and frightening, until what was left was just him trying to be worth the trajectory he'd claimed. I named her, she said, in my head, weeks ago. Isabella, he said. You heard that? I heard it. He held her hand carefully, as if aware it was something that had been extended at some cost. Isabella Mara Vanthorpe Sinclair. Isabella Sinclair Vanthorpe, she said. She should carry both. She should carry both. He nodded. That's right. They sat in the kitchen while the December rain did its work, and the lights in the oak tree outside made the backyard something quiet and bright. And for the first time since September, since the rain-slicked gravel of the Oregon bluff, and the 11 minutes, and the duffel bag, and the terrible freedom of having no idea what was ahead. Mara felt the things she'd been building toward without having a name for it, a future that was genuinely hers, that had been chosen rather than inherited, built from real materials, including the difficult ones. She went to the window and looked at the oaks. Cole stood behind her close but not touching, which was his particular form of asking permission. She leaned back slightly. He put his arms around her, careful of the girl between them, and they stood like that in the winter kitchen while outside Vancouver pursued its December in the reliable rain. This wasn't the plan, she said. No. My plan was Vancouver and the clinic and the remote consulting and a small apartment and independent management of the situation. How's that going? She looked at the oaks. I think I'm managing the situation somewhat differently than planned. Better or worse? She thought about it with her usual precision. Better, she said. Significantly and specifically better. He pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of someone who had been given permission to be close to something and was being careful not to make it into more than it was careful to let it just be what it was, which was enough. The December weeks between the legal resolution and Christmas were the warmest Mara had felt in longer than she could precisely calculate. Cole was in the house most of the time now, not because they'd formalized anything, but because the formalization was the artifact of a moment that had passed, and what had replaced it was simply the daily fact of two people who were against substantial odds, genuinely good for each other. He cooked. This was a fact that continued to surprise her, not because she hadn't known he was capable of it, but because of the specific quality of the way he did it, not as a gesture or a performance, but as a form of attention. He paid attention to what she needed in the way he paid attention to everything precisely without making it into an occasion. She worked at the kitchen desk in the mornings, the forensic consulting that had become her reliable income, and he worked in the second bedroom that had become a de facto office, and Isabella made her ongoing opinions known, and the house organized itself around all three of them with the cheerful indifference of spaces that have found their function. Christmas Eve arrived with an actual frost unusual for Vancouver, the kind of cold that silenced even the reliable rain and left everything bright and still. Cole had gotten a tree which he'd positioned in the front room with the focused attention he applied to things that mattered to him without being things he'd ever done before. It listed slightly to the left. Mara chose not to tell him. The listing she'd decided was a character feature. They were in the front room, she on the armchair she'd claimed as permanently hers, he on the floor near the tree, doing something to the lights that appeared to be winning when her phone rang. She looked at the screen, an unfamiliar number area code she didn't recognize. Cole noticed the pause. Do you need to? Probably not. She put the phone face down. It can go to voicemail. It went to voicemail. She picked it up a few minutes later and played the message on low volume, the way she still played certain things with one ear toward the room. The voice was female. Business adjacent, but not quite professional, with an accent she placed somewhere in the interior of the continent. It said, "Miss Sinclair, you don't know me. My name is Carla Whelan. My husband is Tom Whelan. I understand Cole Vanthorpe reached out to Tom some months ago regarding certain restitution matters. I'm calling because Tom asked me to. He wanted someone connected to that situation to know that what was offered has been more useful than he expected, that it made things possible that he'd given up on." A pause. He also said to say he hopes Mr. Vanthorpe is doing all right. That's a direct quote. Tom's not really a phone person, but that's what he said. Another pause. "Happy holidays." The voicemail ended. Mara put the phone down and sat with it for a moment. "That was Tom Whelan's wife," she said. Cole went very still. "Tom asked her to call. He said to say—" She cleared her throat. "He said to say he hopes you're doing all right." The man on the floor near the listing Christmas tree was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. His expression was one she hadn't seen before. Not the control, not the effort, not the careful containment. Something that had gotten all the way through. "Okay," he said very quietly. "Okay," she said. "That's all." He set down the lights. He stopped. "That's enough. For one Christmas Eve. I think that's enough." She looked at him. He looked at the tree. The front room was very quiet in the way that only frost nights were quiet. The city doing something more interior, more private. The sounds of it muffled and distant. "Come sit over here," she said. He came and sat on the arm of the chair, which was not designed for that purpose and which they both ignored. Isabella registered the arrangement with what Mara had come to think of as her habitual commentary. Mara put her hand over her stomach, and Cole put his hand over hers, and they sat like that while the frost held and the tree listed slightly to the left, and outside the Dunbar Street oaks stood in the cold with the patience of things that had no interest in going anywhere. "She's going to be here in 3 months," he said. "Approximately." Mara looked at the tree lights. "She has her own timeline. I've learned not to predict. She's going to change everything. She's already changed everything." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" She considered the honest answer, which was the only kind she gave. "Of specific things, yes. Of the hard parts, yes. Of not being enough." She paused. "Occasionally, but not most of the time anymore." "What changed?" She looked at him. "I stopped being alone in it." He pressed his lips to her temple. Careful. Deliberate. The small, specific language of someone who was learning consistently to show rather than to withhold. The frost lasted through Christmas morning, and they woke to a city made unfamiliar and beautiful by it, and made coffee, and sat by the tree, and called people they'd been meaning to call. And Isabella made her views on the holiday known with such enthusiasm that Cole put his hand on Mara's stomach and narrated a greeting to her in a low voice that was so specifically absurd and tender that Mara had to look away from him to maintain any useful level of composure. She mostly maintained it. It was, she thought, exactly the right amount of everything. In the first week of January, Cole received the formal consent decree. He signed it on a Tuesday morning, his attorney present the documentation witnessed and filed. He called Mara from the attorney's office when it was done, and she was at the kitchen desk, and she heard in his voice the specific quality of something that had been carried a very long distance, finally being set down. "It's done," he said. "All of it. All of it. The decree is in place. The compliance framework starts next month. The restitution schedule is confirmed." A pause. "It's done. How do you feel?" "Lighter," he said. "Accountable. Ready." He paused. "Like the beginning of something." "That's exactly what it is," she said. She heard him exhale. "I'll be home in an hour." She noticed that he said home. She had noticed, in fact, the first time he'd said it 3 weeks ago, a casual reference, and had filed it in the category of things she was not going to examine too closely, because examining them would require a response she wasn't ready for. She was ready now. "I'll make something," she said. "For dinner. Take your time. You don't have to—" "I want to." She looked at the kitchen she'd claimed and the oaks through the window and the half-finished nursery items she'd been assembling at the table. "I want to make dinner. Come home when you're ready." The last word was a choice. She'd made it with full awareness. "Thank you," he said, and she could hear in it everything it meant. She hung up and sat in the kitchen for a moment. Isabella perhaps reading the particular stillness of the room was quiet for once. Content, unhurried, temporarily settled. "January," Mara said to her. "January is when things start." The girl didn't disagree. She got up and started making dinner. The January that followed was a month of productive dailiness, the kind of dailiness that Mara had spent most of her professional career evacuating toward, in her mind imagining it from the outside as something other people had and was now discovering from the inside to be both more and less than she'd imagined. Less dramatic, obviously, more substantial, more specifically, what it turned out she'd needed. Cole's compliance framework began with a January meeting that he attended with his lead attorney and a compliance officer appointed by the decree, a woman named Sandra Fitch, who was professionally meticulous and apparently had no patience for anything that wasn't completely above board, which was both the point and Cole reported slightly exhausting. Mara liked Sandra Fitch immediately and had not yet met her. "She reminds me of you," Cole said. "You mean she says things that are technically accurate, but you'd prefer to hear differently?" "I mean, she's very specific about what she needs and doesn't apologize for it." He was looking at her with the particular expression she'd learned was his version of affection, which he'd been less careful about concealing since Christmas. "It's a compliment. I know it's a compliment." She looked up from the document she'd been reading. "How did the meeting go, actually?" "Well, the compliance requirements are demanding, but not unreasonable. Sandra is—" He paused, searching for accuracy. "Scrupulously fair. She's not trying to make it harder than it needs to be. She's trying to make it what it needs to be, which is its own kind of discipline. You need that." "I know I need that." He sat across from her. "Knowing I need something and not resenting the having of it is a separate skill. I'm working on it." She looked at him over the document. "You're doing it right now, telling me about resenting something rather than just performing non-resentment. You'd know the difference." "I would." She set the document down. "That's not nothing, Cole. Knowing I'd know the difference and telling me anyway. It's the minimum standard." "It's higher than that. The minimum standard is performing it. The actual standard is doing it." She picked the document back up. "You're doing it." He absorbed this. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About what we're building here." "What about it?" "I want to understand what you want it to look like. Long term. Not just co-parenting that's already figured out, the rest of it." He was being careful, she noted, not to make it into an ultimatum or a proposal or anything that required her to respond to a specific question if she wasn't ready. He was asking her to tell him what she saw. That was different. "I'm not trying to force the question. I just want to know what you're building toward. Because I'd like to be building toward the same thing." She thought about it for a real moment. Not the defensive processing of someone looking for the catch, but the genuine consideration of someone who had enough data now to form a view. "I want Isabella to have a home," she said. "A real one. Not a custody arrangement, not a negotiated schedule, a home that she knows is hers where both of us are present and both of us are consistent." She paused. "I want the work to be mine. My consulting eventually may be something more structured around the forensic analysis, something that I chose and built." "Of course. And I want—" She stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about the foundation idea, not the same as what you originally proposed, but something along those lines. Using what I know, the financial systems side, to help people who've been financially exploited. Coercive control often operates through financial architecture. I understand that architecture." Cole was very still in the way he was still when she said something that surprised him in a good way. "That's a specific and important gap." "I know it is. I've been doing some research. There are existing organizations doing adjacent work, but the forensic component, having someone who can actually untangle what was done to someone, financially document it, make it legible to legal processes, that's underserved. You want to build that. I think I'm already building it. I've been consulting informally for 2 women in the last 2 months who were referred by the community center you helped me find in September." She looked at him. "I wanted to see if it was something I was good at before I said anything." "It is." The expression on his face was the one she'd been thinking of recently as his specific look, the one that was partly admiration and partly something more personal. The look of a man who found the person across the table from him specifically surprising in ways he'd stopped expecting to be surprised. "The resources for that," he said carefully. "I want to help. Not to own it, your organization, your vision, but the infrastructure side. If there's anything I can offer." "I know you want to help." She met his eyes. "I'm going to take you up on it, but on my terms and my timeline. You'll be an advisor, not a director, and I'll fire you if you overreach." "Understood." "I mean it." "I know you mean it." He leaned back. I'm including it in the diary. Mara told me she'd fire me. January 17th. She returned to her document. Good. He went back to whatever he'd been doing on his laptop. The kitchen was quiet and warm, and outside the January rain had settled into its reliable patterns, and the Dunbar Street oaks were doing what oaks did in winter, standing steadily in it, not performing patience, but simply having it. In the last week of January, Rebecca called with a piece of news that Mara had not anticipated. Gregory Strand, Rebecca said, has agreed to cooperate. Fully. The information he's provided has resolved several additional questions relating to Cole's timeline in ways that are favorable. His attorney submitted documentation this morning. A pause. There's also something else. Tell me. One of the men Garrett identified, the two who had contact with Strand's network, has been arrested in connection with a separate matter that's been developing since November. The second has apparently left the jurisdiction. Rebecca's voice was precise and steady. Neither of them is currently in a position to pose any particular concern. Mara sat at the kitchen desk and looked at the January rain on the window. Is that everything? That's everything active, Rebecca said. There may be after effects, that's the nature of these situations. But the structural threat is resolved. Thank you, Rebecca. That's what I'm here for. A pause. Mara, how are you feeling generally? She thought about the question. Stable, she said. Specifically and credibly stable. Good. You sound it. Another pause. The baby. 11 weeks out. She has very strong opinions about everything and communicates them constantly. She takes after her mother. I've heard that theory. She told Cole that evening. He received it the same way he'd received the resolution of his own legal situation, with a stillness that processed it before it became anything external. Then he said, okay. Then he said, good. Then he went to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she let him have the moment, and when he turned around, his face had the expression that she was beginning to think of as simply his, the one underneath all the others, the one that was neither the crime boss nor the careful new version, but just the person who was trying and afraid and specific. I want to ask you something, he said. All right. Not about the situation, not about legal things or the baby or the organization or any of the things we managed together. He came to stand near the table. He reached into the jacket he was wearing and produced something small. He set it on the table between them. It was a ring, simple dark gold, a single stone that was not a diamond. Something darker, more complex, a deep green that she recognized eventually as a precision match for the color of the nursery walls. She looked at it for a long moment. I had it made in December, he said. I wasn't going to ask until I was certain you'd want to be asked. I'm not certain of that now either, but I'm certain enough of the direction that... He stopped. I'd like to marry you. I'm not asking you to commit to a timeline. I'm not asking you to commit to anything beyond the principle of it. But I'd like you to know that's where I am. Mara looked at the ring, at the color of it, at the specific deliberateness of a choice that small and that particular. You had it made to match the nursery, she said. I had it made to match something that matters to you. He paused. You chose that color because you said it felt like something permanent, something that had always been alive. He met her eyes. That's what you are to me. Not the legal situation or the baby or the organization you. The person you've been since the beginning, who I've been trying to be worthy of since September. She picked up the ring. It was the right weight. These things could be the wrong weight and be entirely wrong, and this wasn't. She turned it in the light. The stone caught something and became briefly more than its color, became something living the way certain things did in the right light. The nursery is almost ready, she said. Yes, Isabella will be here in 11 weeks. Approximately. And you've been here since September, every evening, most mornings. Yes. She put the ring on. She didn't do it with ceremony. She did it the way she did most decisive things, directly once she'd arrived at the decision without further deliberation. Cole was very still. I'm not planning a wedding before she's born, she said. I have enough going on. Of course. And I'll want Rebecca to look at any prenuptial arrangements. Obviously. And she looked at him across the table, at the man who had been her investigation and her catastrophe and her home. Cole. Yeah, you're already here, she said. You've been here. That's the thing I kept waiting for evidence of, and it kept just being the evidence. Every day. She paused. Yes, that's the answer. When we're ready, yes. He came around the table and held her carefully because Isabella was between them, And he was always careful of Isabella, and they stood in the kitchen of the house on Dunbar Street in the January dark with the ring on her hand and everything ahead of them. And it was entirely unlike anything either of them had planned, and it was exactly and completely right. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "Don't thank me," she said. "Show up." "Every day," he said. "I'll be here every day." She believed him. That was the important part. Not the ring, not the words, but the belief which she'd arrived at through the only process she trusted. The accumulation of evidence carefully gathered, rigorously interpreted, until the conclusion was no longer tentative, but certain. She was certain. The January rain continued its patient work outside. The oak stood in it. The nursery waited at the end of the hall in its deep eucalyptus green. And in the kitchen of the house that had been a listing Christmas tree and painted walls and evenings without occasion and dinner made with specific attention, the house that had become before either of them had used the word home, two people who had found each other through extraordinary indirection, held on and let the evening be what it was. Which was enough. Which was entirely, specifically, and credibly enough. February came in cold and then went warm, the way February in Vancouver sometimes did, a week of frost followed by 2 weeks of something almost gentle, the kind of weather that felt like the mountain trying to apologize for the previous month. The oaks in the backyard showed the first improbable suggestions of bud. The nursery was finished. Isabella Sinclair Vanthorpe had 11 weeks to appear, which she appeared to be treating as a deadline for her own internal development agenda rather than anyone else's scheduling concern. Mara was 30 weeks. The girl was large enough now that she had very specific opinions about available real estate and negotiated for more of it at odd hours with the focused purpose of someone who understood what she wanted. Mara slept in positions she hadn't previously considered possible and woke up unreasonably early and found to her ongoing surprise that she didn't resent any of it. The disruption was specific. It had a person behind it. She could work with that. Cole had moved the last of his things from the hotel suite to the Dunbar Street house in the final week of January, the process being as unnegotiated and organic as everything else about the way they'd arrived at this particular arrangement. Things had simply appeared over the weeks, and then there were no more hotel suite things. He took the second bedroom that had been his office and made it actually his office. The master bedroom remained hers, which had been a point of clarity she'd established early, and which he'd respected without requiring explanation, sleeping in the guest room with the equanimity of someone who understood that proximity and space were not in conflict. They had not revisited the question of the sleeping arrangement. She was fairly certain they both knew it was a temporary configuration. Neither of them made it into an occasion. He made coffee in the mornings. This was his. She had the mornings to herself until 9, which was his. They ate dinner together almost every night. Isabella had apparently decided she liked the evenings when the house was quieter, and both of them were in it and made her most emphatic contributions to the general conversation at approximately 8 o'clock. "She's going to be nocturnal," Cole said one February evening. "She's already nocturnal. That's the point. How do you feel about nocturnal infants?" "I feel about them exactly as I feel about everything else I haven't done before. Prepared to adapt." He looked at her. "You're remarkably sanguine about all of this." "I was panicked for the first 8 weeks. It passed." She looked at him over her book. "It passes. You do the preparation, and then you do the thing, and you find out it's different from what you expected, but manageable." "In what ways is it different from what you expected?" She considered this. "I expected it to feel more solitary. I thought the pregnancy would be something I was managing by myself, and that the management of it would be the experience. But the experience is—" She paused. "It's more populated than I expected, in good ways." He understood what she was not quite saying. "I didn't expect to be allowed to be present," he said. "I thought I'd be managing from an appropriate distance." "How's that going?" "Poorly," he said, with the not quite smile. "I'm completely present, and I have no useful skills for this." "You have many useful skills. You made that thing last week with the salmon that Isabella apparently found extremely acceptable. She kicked twice. That's significant approval." The ease of it was still something she noticed, not because it was surprising exactly, but because she'd spent enough time braced for difficulty that the ease kept registering as a fact worth noting. They had arguments. They had nights when Cole's default toward solving problems collided with Mara's default toward processing them, and they'd had to find a working register between those two instincts, which had required more than one explicit conversation. They had moments when she was too tired to be easy to be around, and moments when his compliance framework frustrations leaked into the house. But none of it was the disaster she'd been prepared for. None of it was the thing she'd been afraid of. The thing she'd been afraid of was not happening. The first week of February brought a visitor. Rebecca called on a Monday afternoon to say that a woman named Diane Whelan had reached out, not Carla Whelan, who had called at Christmas, but a different Whelan, Tom's sister, as it turned out. She was a family attorney in Portland who had been following the restitution proceedings and had some questions. What kind of questions? Mara asked. About your work, Rebecca said. The forensic consultation work. She has a client who needs exactly what you've been describing, a financial untangling in a domestic control situation. Complex corporate structures used to isolate a spouse from assets. She was referred to me, who referred her to you. Mara thought about this. Tell her I'll call. The call with Diane Whelan lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Mara had agreed to take the case as a consulting engagement with the understanding that the work product would support legal proceedings. It was the most substantial professional engagement she'd undertaken since leaving federal work. It was also very clearly the thing she'd been building toward: the forensic work, the financial untangling, the making visible of structures that had been designed to be opaque. She told Cole about it that evening. He listened without the response she'd have expected from the man she'd first cataloged 3 years ago. No instinct to manage it. No suggestion about how it might be handled more efficiently. No gravitational pull toward owning the outcome. He just listened, asked 2 specific questions about the complexity of the case, and said, "That's what you're supposed to be doing." "I know." She held her coffee. "It feels like that." "Good." He stood. "I'll let you work. You have that look." "What look?" "The one where you're already 3 moves ahead and need to get to a desk." He moved toward the kitchen door. "I'll be in the office if you need anything." She went to the desk and was 3 moves ahead within approximately 45 seconds. The case took 6 weeks. Mara worked on it with the concentrated focus she'd once applied to federal investigations, the forensic accounting instincts she'd spent years developing, unpacking the corporate structure layer by layer until what had been designed to be illegible became, under sufficient rigor, completely readable. She documented everything. She prepared the evidence package with a thoroughness that the attorney said she'd never seen from a consultant in this space. The client's husband's attorney made 2 settlement offers while the work was ongoing. The second was accepted on terms that the client, a woman named Ellen, whose name Mara knew and whose situation she understood in ways that were not entirely professional, described to Diane Whelan as the first time in 11 years she had felt like herself. When Diane conveyed this, Mara sat at the kitchen desk for a moment without moving. Then she picked up her phone and called 3 people she'd been meaning to call about the organization she was building. That was the second week of March. Isabella registered on the shift in the house's energy was particularly active that week, engaged, emphatic vocal in the language of movement that had become her established form of communication. Cole took to narrating back to her, which he'd been doing since December and which he'd entirely stopped being self-conscious about. And Mara found that she looked forward to the evenings when she could hear him through the wall or from another room conducting the specific, absurd, tender conversation that had become their daughter's most reliable response to hearing his voice. "You're going to embarrass her," Mara told him. "When she's old enough to be embarrassed, we'll cross that bridge," he said. "Right now, she likes it." "She does like it," Mara agreed, "suspiciously much. She has good taste. She's biased. You're literally inside her world. Any voice in there gets disproportionate credibility. I prefer my interpretation." "I know you do." The legal compliance review in the 3rd week of February went well, according to Sandra Fitch, who communicated this to Cole in the manner of someone reporting a functional outcome rather than a success, because the expectation was function, and anything less would be its own kind of problem. Cole came home from it with the particular energy of someone who'd done something genuinely difficult correctly, and they'd had dinner and talked about the compliance framework and what it was teaching him about the legitimate business operations, which were performing more robustly than either of them had projected. "The port contracts that are genuinely competitive," he said, "are actually winning more volume than they were when I had the corrupt ones in play, because the teams have had to get genuinely better to compete without the arrangement." "Competition improves performance," Mara said. "It's a revolutionary concept in some sectors." He held her eyes. "I should have understood that earlier. There are things I built that I told myself needed the shortcuts because the legitimate path wasn't viable, and I was wrong." "Were you wrong, or were you impatient?" He considered that. "Impatient," he said, which is its own kind of wrong. It is, but it's a different kind from the kind that can't be corrected. You make careful distinctions. Always. He reached across the table and picked up her hand, the one with the ring on it, which she'd been wearing since January without ceremony, and which she'd noticed was something she now looked for when she reached for things, a small orienting presence. He turned it in the light briefly and then set it down. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the kind of gesture that accrued meaning through repetition. She was learning to accept those. The last week of March arrived with the baby. Or rather, the last week of March arrived with the beginning of the baby, which was itself a process of several hours' duration that Mara had prepared for extensively, and which remained, despite the preparation, the most specific and consuming physical experience of her life. She woke at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday with contractions that were unmistakably not practice. She lay still for 20 minutes, timing them before she was certain enough to do anything. Then she turned on the bedside light and said to the ceiling, "She's coming." Cole from the guest room through the wall, "I heard." She didn't ask how he'd heard. The house was not large. She suspected he'd been a light sleeper since October. "You can come in," she said. He appeared in the doorway dressed, which she noted because it meant he'd already gotten up when the contractions had started and had been waiting in the dark in the guest room for her to be ready for him to be present. This was so specifically Cole, the preparing, the waiting, the not forcing the timing, that she made a sound that was not precisely appropriate to the circumstances, which were genuinely painful by this point. "What?" he said. "Nothing. Come in. Sit down. Contractions are 7 minutes apart." He sat in the chair by the window. He was calm in the way she recognized the surface steadiness of someone who was not calm underneath, but had determined that underneath was not where calm needed to live right now. She knew this because she could see his hands, which were very still in the deliberate manner of hands being kept that way. "Stop controlling your hands," she said between contractions. He looked at them. Then he unclenched them and rested them loosely on the chair arms. "Better, better." She breathed through the next one. "She's going to be here today." "She is." His voice was careful. "How are you feeling?" "Very specifically aware of my physical reality." She breathed again. "I've been told this is what intensity feels like. I'm prepared to accept that characterization. You're going to be... Don't tell me I'm going to be fine. Tell me something accurate." He thought for a moment. "You're the most capable person I've ever known, and you've been prepared for this for 6 months. You know what to do and when to ask for help, and the difference between those two things." "That's accurate," she said. "Yes. Thank you." She waited out a contraction. "Call Dr. Suen, then we'll go." He called Dr. Suen. Then they went. The hospital was Dr. Suen's preferred facility, a 15-minute drive in the early Tuesday morning, while Vancouver slept, the streets clean and empty, and the mountains behind the city showing their tops in the pre-dawn clarity. Cole drove. Mara breathed. The girl was doing something insistent and unmistakable and completely dedicated to her own process, which was, Mara thought, already characteristic. Dr. Suen met them. The next 8 hours were a document Mara would carry for the rest of her life, not in detail, which was already blurring at the edges, but in the accumulation of specific moments, the way Cole held her hand through each contraction without commentary or flinching, the way Dr. Suen managed the room with her particular version of competent calm, the 3 o'clock hour when everything became very focused and very loud and very much more than Mara had anticipated, even having anticipated it extensively. And then 12:17 in the afternoon, a sound that reorganized everything. Dr. Suen said, "Here she is," and Isabella Sinclair Vanthorpe arrived. She was placed on Mara's chest in the particular messy immediacy of newborn existence, and she was louder than expected and heavier than imagined and absolutely and completely real. Mara pressed her cheek to the top of her daughter's head and felt the world shift on its axis in a way that had nothing to do with the physical and everything to do with the irreversible. "Hi," she said very quietly to the small, furious person on her chest. "There you are." The crying stopped. Isabella, registering the voice she'd been hearing for 8 months, went briefly still. "There you are," Mara said again. Cole was beside her. She hadn't looked at him yet. She knew without looking what she'd see, and she wanted to be steady before she did. Then she turned and looked. His face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. Not the controlled neutrality, not the careful accessibility, not even the stripped-back vulnerability of their worst and best conversations. Just open, present. The face of a man who was completely in the thing that was happening with nothing between himself and it. "Isabella," he said. barely audible. Isabella, she agreed. He reached out and put one careful finger against his daughter's hand, and Isabella, because she was already exactly who she was going to be, wrapped her hand around it with the absolute confidence of someone who already knew where she belonged. There, Cole said. There. The hours after Isabella's arrival were the hours that belonged to all new parents exhausted and flooded and attempting to organize the unorganizable. Dr. Suin's team was efficient and kind. Isabella was examined and weighed and declared the specific variety of healthy that makes the people in the room exhale. Cole held her while Mara was attended to, and when Mara looked at them across the room, her daughter in this man's arms, both of them apparently engaged in some form of nonverbal negotiation, she felt the feeling she'd been circling towards since September finally arrived, cleanly, not tentative, not conditional, not waiting on further evidence. Just love. Sufficient and specific and entirely certain. The ward quieted in the late afternoon. Isabella slept with the absolute commitment of someone who'd had a very full day. Cole sat in the chair by the bed, not sleeping, watching with the expression she'd come to think of as his actual face, the one that lived beneath the others. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." "I will. I'm processing." "Me too." He looked at the bassinet where Isabella was conducting her first serious sleep. "I keep expecting it to feel smaller than it does." "Does it?" "No." He shook his head. "It keeps getting larger. Every time I look at her, it's larger." Mara knew what he meant. "She's very small," she said. "The smallness is the worst part. She's completely dependent on us for everything. That's what parenthood is." "I know what it is intellectually." He looked at Mara. "But you knew what it was intellectually too, and then she arrived and the intellectual understanding was decorative," Mara said. "Decorative. Yes. The actual thing is entirely different." She shifted against the pillows. The room was warm and quiet, and outside the Vancouver afternoon was doing something gentle with its light through the window. "Cole." "Yeah." "She has your attention, even when she's asleep. You can't look anywhere else." "I know. That's going to matter to her." Mara held his eyes. Being looked at like that, not past her, or at what she represents or what she needs to become. Just at her as she is. She paused. "It's the thing you did for me when we first met. I noticed it then. I'm noticing it now." He was quiet for a moment. "It's the only way I know to pay attention. Don't change it." She let the words settle. "Don't change that." "I won't." She reached for his hand where it rested on the edge of the bed and held it, and they sat in the hospital room while Isabella slept, and the afternoon light moved through the window, and the particular irreversible thing that had happened continued to settle into the shape it was going to take. "When do you want to get married?" he said after a while. She considered. "Summer," she said. "Small. The garden. The Dunbar garden. The Dunbar garden. The oaks are good in summer." "They are," he said. "They're already good. Don't get sentimental about the oaks." "I'm already sentimental about the oaks." She squeezed his hand. "Summer," she said again. "We'll figure out the rest." He squeezed back. "We'll figure out the rest." Isabella chose this moment to wake up, which she did with the complete commitment she would bring to everything, immediate, vocal, entirely certain about what she needed. Mara started to move, and Cole was already there, already lifting her with the careful competence of someone who'd read every relevant chapter and had also clearly been paying attention to the nurses all afternoon. "Hi," he said to his daughter. "Hi, we're here." Isabella registered on his voice, went through a brief sequence of options, and then settled, still making clear she had requirements but making them less urgently, with the specific confidence of someone who had already learned in the first 4 hours of her life that there were people paying attention. Mara watched them. She thought about September, the bluff, and the gravel, and the duffel bag, and the 11 minutes, and the rain. She thought about the Hotel Georgia and the 3 words left outside her apartment door. She thought about the document she'd signed in Rebecca's office, and the ring that matched the nursery and the listing Christmas tree, and all the specific daily evidence that had accumulated over 5 months into something she was no longer willing to treat as tentative. She thought, this is the thing. Not the legal resolution or the criminal history or the careful contracts or the extraordinary indirection of how they'd arrived here. This room, this Tuesday afternoon, this girl, this is the thing. "You're good at that," she told Cole. He looked up from Isabella. "I'm terrible at it. I don't know what I'm doing. None of us do. But you're doing it anyway." She held out her arms. "Come here, both of you." He brought Isabella to the bed, and they settled carefully, 3 people reconfiguring themselves into a new arrangement, still figuring out the geometry of it. and Isabella made her considered assessment of the situation and apparently found it acceptable, and the room was quiet except for the February becoming March sounds of Vancouver through the window, and nothing in the moment was dramatic or resolved or complete in the way that endings are sometimes depicted. It was just very specifically the beginning of something, which was better. The weeks after Isabella's arrival had the quality of deep water, not turbulent, but entirely immersive, the normal world visible from within, but at a remove. Mara had expected the exhaustion. She had expected the learning curve, the recalibration of every prior assumption about time and priorities. The specific humbling of discovering that the most formidable intelligence she'd applied for 4 years of professional work was not particularly relevant to the question of why a 3-week-old was crying at 2 in the morning. She had not expected the tenderness. Not as a concept she'd understood it was coming, but as a lived daily, almost unbearable quality of the specific days. Isabella was specific in a way that blindsided her. Not an infant generically, but this infant with her particular opinions and her father's attention quality and her apparently strong views about which blanket she preferred and the exact angle at which she wanted to be held during certain hours. She was a person. She had been a person from the first moment, and that fact kept arriving with fresh impact every morning. Cole was... She kept arriving at the same word present. Not present in the managed way she'd feared or the hovering way she'd braced for, but present the way the oaks were present, simply and completely there, without requiring the fact of themselves to be remarked upon. He took the 2 to 4 shift because he'd determined empirically that it was the one that hit Mara hardest, and he was better than her at functioning on fragmented sleep, which was a statement she'd verified over several nights and accepted as data. He made food that appeared at appropriate intervals. He handled the aspects of the compliance framework from the Dunbar office during the hours when Isabella was asleep, and Mara was either working or sleeping herself. He did not try to fix the exhaustion. He had learned, and she knew it had been learned, not natural, because natural for him was problem and solution, that the exhaustion was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be moved through, and that the moving through was something he could be alongside her for, rather than manage on her behalf. That distinction mattered. She told him so in the 4th week when she was finally surfacing enough to locate the words. It matters because of what it isn't, she said. It isn't trying to make it easier in ways that would make me more dependent. You're just here. Here is what I can do, he said. The rest of it is yours. The rest of it is ours. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't sure you were ready to say ours yet. I've been ready for a while. I was just calibrating. You calibrate everything. It's a feature, she said. I've decided. I know it's a feature. I've known since September. The compliance review at the end of March was Sandra Fitch's 2nd visit. She arrived with the same meticulous efficiency, worked through the documentation with the same scrupulous fairness, and at the end of the meeting said something she had apparently been debating whether to say, and had decided to say because it was accurate. The business is healthier, Mr. Vanthorpe. The legitimate operations. They're performing at a level the models didn't predict this quickly. Whatever decisions you've made in the last 6 months, they're showing up in the numbers in ways I didn't expect. Cole received this the way he received most things now, with a steadiness that didn't require it to be more than it was. Thank you, he said. I'm not complimenting you, she said with the mild precision of someone who was absolutely complimenting him. I'm reporting a data point. Of course. After she left, he came to find Mara in the nursery, where Isabella was conducting a particularly serious nap, and Mara was reading in the rocking chair with one foot on the floor in the specific attitude of someone who might need to move at any moment. Fitch, he said. I heard. The house was not large. How do you feel? Like the numbers are honest. Like honest numbers feel different from ones that were constructed to look a certain way. He leaned in the doorway. Like I don't miss the constructed version. Do you? No. He looked at Isabella. No. I miss certain things about operating the old way. Efficiency, directness, the ability to resolve problems without going through 14 official channels. He paused. But I don't miss what I was. The version of me that thought those shortcuts were necessary. I don't miss being that person. Who told you they were necessary? He thought about it. Me. I told myself. Mostly. He met her eyes. The organization shaped me and I shaped the organization, and we each gave the other permission to be worse than we needed to be. And at some point, I stopped being able to tell what I'd chosen from what I'd inherited. And now, Now, what I'm doing is clearly what I've chosen. Every part of it. He looked at his sleeping daughter, including the parts that are very hard, the 14 official channels. Primarily, a ghost of the not quite smile. Also the 4 a.m. shift. You volunteered for the 4 a.m. shift. I know. I'm complaining about it for solidarity. I appreciate the solidarity. She looked at Isabella. Cole, in June, when the compliance year hits its midpoint review, Fitch is going to have numbers that are 6 months of clean data. Will that be enough to have a conversation about some of the restrictions easing? Probably. Rebecca thinks so. My attorney thinks so. He paused. Why? Because I want to take Isabella to see the coast, down to Oregon. Not the estate, just the coast. She looked at him. I want to show her the Columbia River, where some of it started. He was still for a moment. Why? Because she should know her whole story, including the parts that were difficult. Mara held his eyes. You were building something on a bluff above the Columbia when I left. You're building something different now. Those are both her stories. She should get to know the landscape. Cole looked at his daughter in the way he often did, as if the looking were itself a form of communication that she was receiving even in sleep. The estate is sold, he said. I sold it in February. The proceeds are in the restitution fund. She hadn't known this. You didn't tell me. I was going to. I kept finding the wrong moment. He looked at her. It felt private, the selling of it, like something I needed to do without making it into an announcement. She sat with this. Okay. I understand the private part. Tell me the next time something that size is happening. I will. She believed him. That was the thing she kept arriving at the belief, which was no longer a tentative conclusion, but a settled one arrived at through the only method she'd ever trusted. The evidence was extensive and consistent and pointed in one direction, and she was not someone who disregarded consistent evidence. There's a stretch of coast south of Astoria, she said. I used to drive it when I was doing field work in Oregon, before any of this. There are sea stacks you can walk around at low tide, and a lighthouse that's been there since the 1880s. I know it. We'll take her there, when it's warm enough, when she can see more than 3 feet in front of her. She'll see what she sees, the rest she'll absorb. Mara looked at her daughter. Babies take in everything, even the things they can't process yet. Isabella chose this moment to shift in her sleep a small reorganization and put her hand up near her cheek in the gesture that both of them had separately described as her most specific look, the one that was entirely hers, neither her mother's nor her father's. Something new. There she is, Cole said quietly. There she is, Mara agreed. They stood in the doorway of the green nursery, watching their daughter sleep, and the April light was coming through the window in the way that April light comes through in Vancouver. Warm but not presumptuous present without overstating itself, and nothing that needed to be said was being left unsaid. The organization held its first official meeting in the second week of April. Mara had incorporated it properly in March, the Pacific Forensic Advocacy Network, which was a name she'd arrived at with the help of Diane Whelan and 2 women from the community center and a long conversation with Rebecca, who had a gift for making things accurate and legible simultaneously. The mandate was the one she'd described to Cole in January: forensic financial analysis, in support of legal proceedings for people experiencing coercive control, the specific gap she'd identified, the specific skills she had. The first meeting was 6 people around her kitchen table on a Saturday morning. Diane Whelan, Rebecca, 2 advocates from partner organizations, a financial attorney from the downtown Vancouver Legal Aid Clinic, and a forensic software specialist Mara had found through a professional network. Isabella attended in Cole's arms because childcare on Saturdays was still a negotiated reality, and because Cole had said without being asked that he could handle Saturday mornings. He sat with Isabella in the corner of the kitchen during the 2-hour meeting, not in the meeting, present in the room. Isabella slept for the first 40 minutes and then participated in the subsequent hour and 20 minutes with the engaged vocal commentary she'd been developing, which Diane Whelan found charming and which Mara pretended not to notice. When everyone left, Cole brought Isabella to where Mara was standing at the kitchen window, looking at the spring oaks, and stood behind her with Isabella held against his shoulder. How was it? He said. Good. Real. She looked at the oaks. The case pipeline is already there, 3 referrals in the next 4 weeks. Diane has 2 more pending. She turned. It's going to work. Of course it's going to work. You can't know that. I know you. That's sufficient data. He held her gaze over Isabella's head. For what it's worth watching you run that meeting. That's what you're supposed to be doing. I knew it before you knew it.
You've been saying that since January.
Because it's been true since January. She reached up and touched Isabella's hand, the small fist on his shoulder, the perfect miniature of something impossibly large. We're doing all right, she said. We're doing better than all right. Don't oversell it. I'm reporting accurately, he said. For once in my life, I'm reporting exactly what's true. He held her eyes. We're doing well. The three of us. Concretely and specifically, well. She looked at him, at Isabella, at the oaks through the window with their April leaves still new and bright, at the ring on her hand that she still noticed as a small orienting fact every morning when she reached for things. Summer, she said. The garden. The garden, he agreed. Something small, very small. And you have to let the oaks be slightly off-center in the ceremony setup. They don't arrange. I know they don't arrange. That's why they're good. He looked at the oaks with the expression she'd decided was his actual face, the permanent one, the one under all the management. They're not decorative, they're just there. That's a surprisingly poetic thing to say. I've been reading. He looked at her. Expanding my vocabulary. Is that what we're calling it? It's what I'm calling it. He pressed a brief kiss to the top of her head as he did, with the calibrated certainty of someone who had been given a specific permission and was being exact about not exceeding it. Come on, she needs her walk and you need something to eat, in that order. She got her coat. He got Isabella's carrier, assembled it with the proficiency of a man who'd been in intensive training for 6 weeks, and positioned his daughter with the small private commentary he always offered her during transitions, the gentle, matter-of-fact narration that she'd somehow become entirely dependent on overhearing. They went out into the April afternoon, the three of them, the Oaks doing their April thing with the quiet authority of things that had no interest in being anywhere else. The neighborhood was warm and specific, and entirely ordinary in all the ways that mattered. Mara walked beside Cole and felt the day moving through her hands like water, not trying to hold it, just letting it be what it was. Some days were going to be what this one was, good and clear and warm with April, and full of the kind of dailiness that turned out to be the thing. Not the resolution or the achievement or the completion of any particular arc, but this, the walk and the oaks, and her daughter in the carrier against Cole's chest, and the work she was building and the future that was no longer uncertain in the ways that had once made it frightening. It was uncertain in entirely different ways now, better ones. She could work with that. She always could. May arrived with the specific ambition of a month that knows it precedes something. The trees were completely in leaf now, the oaks in the back of the Dunbar house doing what they'd been patiently preparing to do since the first February bud filling the backyard with the kind of green that made the light through it seem like something different from other light. Mara noticed this while feeding Isabella in the kitchen one morning and filed it in the category of things she'd been noticing since the girl arrived that she would not previously have noticed at all. Parenthood had changed her perception in ways she was still mapping. She noticed small things differently. The specific quality of Thursday mornings, the way Isabella's weight had changed from something precarious to something that settled against her like a rightness, the way Cole moved through the house purposefully but not urgently, the controlled grace of someone who had stopped needing to perform the control and was therefore more genuinely graceful. Isabella was 9 weeks. She had opinions now that were legible without translation. Distinct expressions for distinct states, the specific face she made when she was deciding whether something was acceptable, the unmistakable expression of contentment that appeared when both her parents were in the same room and she could triangulate their voices. That one Mara noticed particularly, the triangulating. She does that thing, Mara said one morning. What thing? Where she can hear both of us and she goes very still and sort of listens to the room. Mara looked at Isabella, who was demonstrating the thing in real time. Like she's taking inventory. Cole looked at his daughter with the expression Mara had stopped cataloging separately from the others because it was now just his face around Isabella. She's checking, he said. Checking what? That we're both there. He looked at Mara. She's been doing it since she was 3 weeks old. I noticed in the hospital when you and I were both in the room, she was quieter than when it was just one of us. She calibrates to the combination. Mara looked at her daughter. You're saying she's already attuned to us as a unit. I'm saying she knows the difference between 1 and 2. He paused. In the way that matters to her. We're her world. She knows when all of her world is in the room. The simplicity of it. The accuracy of it sat with Mara in the particular way that simple, accurate things did when they arrived in unexpected forms. She reached across the table and put her hand over Cole's, not in response to anything except the morning and the baby and the oaks and the fact that this was the shape of her days now, which was a fact she was no longer treating as provisional.
Summer, she said again. July, he said. Whenever you want in July.
The 15th, if the weather cooperates. If it doesn't cooperate, we do it in the rain. The oaks are good in rain too. They are, she said. You've been spending a lot of time with the oaks. I have opinions about the oaks now. I didn't before. Another thing that's changed. She looked at him. At the morning light. At Isabella currently conducting a serious investigation of her own hands, which had recently emerged as a topic of great interest to her. I was going to leave you twice more, she said. He looked at her. In December, when the federal inquiry came, and in January when I found out about the estate being sold without me knowing. She held his gaze. I had the plan both times. Old habits. What stopped you? She thought about the accurate answer.
You did. Not by doing anything to stop me, by continuing to be what the data showed you were. She paused. You kept being consistently yourself, and the self you kept being was the direction, not the history.
Cole was quiet for a long moment. Isabella made a discovery about her left hand and announced it. I knew you were deciding, he said. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew. You didn't try to influence it.
You would have known if I had.
I would have. She looked at their hands on the table. That's why it worked. That you didn't. The not trying, he said, is the most difficult thing I've ever done. In a life that has included a number of difficult things.
I know it was. You could tell. I could tell, she said. You're not actually as opaque as you think you are. Not to me.
Something moved across his face, the quality she'd identified in December and had been watching deepen ever since the specific look of a man who is being known and has stopped being afraid of it. No, he said. I figured that out.
Good, she said.
Stay figured out. Isabella made another announcement about the hand situation. They both turned to look. The investigation had expanded to include the air approximately 6 inches above the hand, which was generating data. She's going to be a researcher, Cole said. She's going to be exactly who she is, Mara said. We don't get to decide. No, we just get to watch. And be there, he agreed. That's all. That's everything. The oaks moved outside in the May morning, and the light in the kitchen was the kind that asked nothing of anyone, and Isabella continued her research with the complete dedication of someone whose entire world was interesting, and Mara let the morning be what it was, ordinary and full of consequence, and entirely specifically hers. The July wedding was on the 15th, as Mara had said, and the weather cooperated with the slightly surprised quality of Pacific Northwest summers when they commit to something. The garden on Dunbar Street was not designed for ceremonies. It was designed for oaks and a stone path and a lawn that required maintenance and received it without drama. Cole had asked once if they should hire someone to transform it to bring in florists and lighting and the architectural apparatus of an event, and Mara had said no with a specificity that ended the conversation. The oaks were what the garden was. She wasn't interested in the garden pretending to be something else. So there were no florists. There were chairs borrowed from the community center arranged in 2 short rows with an aisle of stone between them. There were flowers cut from the garden itself. Nothing exotic. Nothing arranged by a professional. Just what was there. Lavender from the border beds, some late roses from the climber on the east fence, a handful of oak leaves because the oaks were the oaks. Rebecca had made the arrangements with the practical efficiency she brought to most things, which meant they looked good without looking labored. 14 people attended. Rebecca, who was both matron of honor and the person most likely to have organized the morning's logistics before anyone else arrived. Diane Whelan, who had become a genuine friend in the months since the first call with her husband Tom, who was attending his first social event in some time and had the careful dignity of someone doing so as an act of deliberate forward motion. Sandra Fitch, who had been invited on an instinct of Mara's and had accepted with the precise brevity of a woman who received invitations correctly. 3 members of Cole's legitimate business team who were there because they'd earned the inclusion. The woman named Ellen, whose case Mara had untangled in February, who had called in May to say she was doing well, and whom Mara had called back, and who had somehow become the kind of person who was at the wedding because she was. 2 colleagues from the advocacy network, Dr. Patricia Suen, who had delivered Isabella and had accepted the invitation with the same focused kindness she brought to everything. Isabella, 4 months old and entirely clear about her own significance to the proceedings, was held by Rebecca until the moment Mara walked out into the garden, at which point Mara took her because Isabella in her arms was where she wanted to start the afternoon. Cole was standing at the end of the stone path with the oaks behind him, and the July light making everything very clear. He was wearing something that was not the careful jacket and was not the commanding suits of his previous life. Something in between specifically chosen, which he recognized as the sartorial equivalent of everything else he'd been calibrating since September. He looked like himself. The one underneath all the previous versions, the one who had been trying to get out since the first night at the Portland reception. She walked toward him through the garden, Isabella in her arms. Rebecca 1 step behind. The 14 people on the borrowed chairs were very quiet. The Oaks did their thing, just the Oaks. When she reached him, he looked at her with the look that was his actual face, and then at Isabella, and then at her again. "Hi," he said quietly. "Hi," she said. The officiant was Rebecca's cousin, who had a civil celebrant license and a gift for being economical. With language, they'd briefed her thoroughly on what they wanted, which was short and accurate, and she delivered it exactly that way. They exchanged vows that Mara had written herself and Cole had written himself, and that neither of them had shown the other beforehand, which had been a choice they'd made, and which turned out to be correct because the surprise of hearing each other's words was the thing that made the ceremony real rather than rehearsed. Mara said, "I came to you looking for something to document and found something I didn't have a category for. I've been careful most of my life about the difference between what I know and what I believe. With you, I've learned that some things don't wait for knowledge, they arrive as conviction and ask you to catch up. I've been catching up since September. I'm caught up. I'm here. That's what I'm promising to be here for this, for all the specific, ordinary, difficult days of it, because the days are the thing, and I want the days with you." Cole said, "I've been in rooms my whole life where the point was to be unreadable. You read me anyway. You read me while I was still trying to argue that there was nothing there to read, and you told me what you found without softening it, and then you stayed while I figured out what to do with what you'd seen. I'm not going to promise you perfection or certainty or that everything ahead of us is going to be easy. I'm going to promise you the direction, every day the direction, and the honest accounting of every deviation from it. That's everything I have. It's enough." Isabella registered the weight of the moment in the way she registered everything by going very still, triangulating, listening to the room. They were married in the garden in the July sun, while the oaks stood in their patient way, and when it was done, the afternoon opened into itself, and the 14 people became a party. In the way that small rite gatherings sometimes do, not effortful, not orchestrated, just the natural ease of people who were glad to be in the same place for a specific reason. Tom Whelan found Mara near the east fence an hour later. He was a quiet man, she'd established that from their first conversation, but quiet in the manner of someone with considerable interior weather, not from absence of it. "The work you've been doing," he said. "Diane told me about the network, the forensic piece. It's getting started," she said. "It's needed." He looked at his wife across the garden, who was in animated conversation with Rebecca. "What was done to us, the financial dimension of it, was the part that took longest to untangle legally, because it looked legitimate on the surface. Because the documentation was designed to." He paused. "Having someone who can make it legible to a court. That matters." "That's the whole point of it," she said. He nodded. He looked at Isabella in Cole's arms across the garden. "He came to see me, before I knew he was going to do any of this." "I know. He didn't have to do that." Tom Whelan looked at her with the direct regard of someone who had assessed things at some personal cost and arrived at conclusions they were going to stand by. Most people, given what he had to gain from staying quiet, would have stayed quiet. He didn't. He paused. "I'm not saying it makes it right. I'm saying it makes it something." "It's something," she said. "It's the right direction." "It's the right direction," he agreed. Later, after the guests had gone, and Isabella was down for what they were calling her evening meditation, because calling it anything more hopeful seemed to tempt fate. Mara sat on the stone path in the backyard with her shoes off and the July dusk going its gentle way above the oaks. Cole brought her a glass of something cold and sat beside her on the path. They sat in the quiet for a while. The street sounds were distant and ordinary. The oaks held their summer leaves in the particular way of things that have been at it long enough to be sure of themselves. "Tom Whelan talked to me," she said. I know. I saw.
He looked at the oaks.
How was it? Good. She paused. He said what you did matters. Going to see him, saying it directly.
Cole was quiet for a moment. I should have gone sooner.
Probably. But you went, she said.
I went. That's all we can do. Go when we understand we need to. He turned to look at her. In the July dusk, he was the version she'd settled on as primary. Not the crime boss. Not the careful man in the quiet jacket, just him. The person the Portland reception had briefly let through, who had been gradually and with some difficulty making his way to the surface ever since.
Are you happy? He said. She considered the question with the precision she brought to all direct questions. Specifically and verifiably happy, she said. In ways I can account for. In the daily sense. She held his gaze. Yes. Good. He looked back at the oaks. Same. Same isn't sufficient as a response.
No.
He thought about it for a moment. Grateful. More specifically than I've ever felt anything. He paused. Like I've been given something I was told implicitly for most of my life people like me didn't get to have.
What kind of thing?
The ordinary thing, he said. The kitchen and the walk, and the person in the other chair, and the specific ordinary, difficult, good daily thing of a life with people in it who are there because they chose to be, not because they're paid or afraid or obligated. He paused. I had a lot of people around me for 20 years. I didn't have that. She put her head briefly against his shoulder. He put his arm around her carefully, the way he was always careful. You have it now, she said.
I know I have it now. Don't waste it.
Mara. His voice had the specific quality she'd learned to read as his most honest register. You know I won't. She knew he wouldn't. That was the thing she kept arriving at, and which had stopped feeling like a conclusion that required continuous re-verification and had become simply a known fact in the category with the rest of the known facts of her life that she no longer checked because they were established. He wouldn't waste it. He would show up. He would tell her the truth and take the correction when he needed it and be the direction consistently in the daily, ordinary, specific way that turned out to be the only way that mattered. She knew this the way she knew the oaks would be there in the morning. Isabella appeared 3 months later in the data of Mara's work in a way that was indirect but unmistakable. A forensic analysis Mara completed in early October led to a resolution that allowed a woman to leave a 20-year marriage with the financial documentation to establish what had been done to her and receive appropriate restitution. The woman's attorney called Mara when it was settled not to report the resolution she'd already received that, but to say that the woman had asked her to convey something that the most important part had been having someone who understood the structure, who could see through the architecture to what was real, who could make the invisible visible to people who needed to act on it. Mara sat at the kitchen desk and thought about architecture, about the years she'd spent following money through structures designed to be invisible, and the ways that skill had transferred from federal investigative work to building a case against a man she was now married to, and from there eventually to building a case for people who needed the same capacity deployed in their direction. She thought about what Rebecca had said early on the trajectory, not the history, the direction. She opened a new document and started drafting the framework for the network's second-year operating structure. Isabella in Cole's office, across the house, was conducting an explanation of something to someone, probably her father, who was almost certainly listening with the focused attention he applied to everything that came from her. The conversation was not intelligible through the wall, but its quality was the earnest rising cadence of a 4-month-old who has a great deal to say and a full expectation of being heard. Cole's voice responding low, specific, the "you have my full attention" register. Mara listened to this for a moment without stopping her work. Then she worked. In November, the organization received its first grant, a mid-sized award from a foundation that supported legal aid infrastructure, which Mara had applied for in August with the help of Diane Whelan and a grant writer she'd found through the Community Center network. The amount was sufficient to hire the first part-time staff member, a forensic accounting associate, 3 years out of school, who had found the network's work through a legal aid listserv and whose cover letter had been the most precisely articulate thing Mara had read in a professional context since her own work product. She hired her. Her name was Petra Kim. She started the following Monday and was very good at her job and asked better questions than most people Mara had encountered professionally, which meant Mara liked her immediately and said so in the plainest possible terms, which Petra appeared to find both surprising and acceptable. Cole's 6-month compliance review in early October was Sandra Fitch's most positive report of the year. The business was performing well. The compliance framework was being followed. Without exception, the restitution schedule was ahead of its projected timeline. Sandra said, with her particular manner of delivering facts that happened to be good, the second year will involve reduced reporting requirements. You've established the trajectory. Cole received this in his usual manner, measured without making it into anything beyond what it was. He told Mara about it that evening in the kitchen matter-of-factly. She used the word trajectory, Mara said.
She did.
Is that coincidental? Probably. He paused. I may have used it in conversation with her at some point. It's a good word.
It is.
It means the direction matters more than the starting position. He looked at her, which I believe to be correct. It is correct. She went back to what she'd been reading. Well done, by the way.
Thank you.
Don't get comfortable.
I know better.
She smiled at the document. December arrived with Isabella 4 months old and conducting a developmental agenda of enormous ambition, grabbing things, responding to things, demonstrating opinions about things, with the clear implication that these opinions were going to get both more specific and more strongly expressed over time. She had Cole's focused attention and Mara's precision about what she was interested in, which turned out to be a combination that made her formidable at 4 months and was likely to only become more so. We're in trouble, Cole said one evening, watching their daughter conduct a systematic investigation of the dinner table. We have been in trouble since March, Mara said. She's been this person since she arrived. We're only now seeing the application layer. The application layer is very advanced. It will continue to advance. Yes, he watched Isabella. She's going to run something someday. Something significant. She's going to run whatever she wants, Mara said. That's the point. Is that the point? That's the whole point. She looked at her daughter. Everything we're building, the network, the legitimate business, this house us. The point is that she has the full range, that she doesn't have to choose between what she comes from and who she can become. She paused. That she has choices. Real ones. Cole was quiet for a moment. Like you didn't, he said. I had choices. They were just expensive. She picked up Isabella, who had arrived at a conclusion about the dinner table and was ready to move on. She'll have cheaper ones. Because of what you built. Because of what we built. She held her daughter's gaze, the direct assessing look that was already so specifically hers, the expression of someone who was gathering data and intended to do something with it. Because of what she's going to build too. On top of it. Isabella made a pronouncement. She agrees, Cole said. She's been agreeing since September, Mara said. Since before she was born. She looked at him. She knew before we did. She's smarter than both of us. Obviously. Mara held her daughter. She picked us. The year turned with the understated reliability of years, and the one that followed had the character of things that are built rather than arrived at brick by brick, day by day. The accumulation of specific ordinary moments that were individually unremarkable and collectively the thing. The Forensic Advocacy Network expanded its casework in the first quarter, took on its second staff member in the spring, formed a formal partnership with Diane Whelan's family law practice that made the referral pipeline more efficient and the outcomes more durable. Mara testified twice in proceedings where her forensic analysis was entered as evidence both times with the precision that had always been her professional signature and that was now deployed entirely in the right direction. Cole's consent decree reached its 2-year review without a single compliance failure. Sandra Fitch delivered this assessment with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness she brought to everything and added, "The reduced supervision period begins next quarter. You've been an exemplary subject of this process," which was the highest possible compliment from Sandra Fitch, and Cole received it accordingly. He told Tom Whelan in person. Tom had over the course of the year shifted from something like wary acceptance to something that was not friendship exactly, but was the adjacent thing. The particular relationship that forms between people who have navigated a significant shared fact and come out the other side of it with enough mutual respect to want to continue in the same direction. They met for coffee occasionally. Tom had opinions about legitimate maritime commerce that were well-informed and useful. Cole listened to them. Isabella turned one in March, which was a fact of such specific magnitude that both her parents spent a portion of the week before it in a state of quiet disbelief that a year had elapsed and then organized a small gathering in the Dunbar Garden because the oaks were coming into their spring leaf and the garden was where the significant things happened. Isabella participated in her birthday party with the full engagement of someone for whom all of life was currently significant, which was accurate. She was walking, by that point had been walking since 11 months, with the focused determination of someone who had a destination and was tired of the slower method. She walked through the party, making assessments of things, sitting down to examine items of interest, standing back up without particular ceremony when the examination was complete. Everyone at the party found this enchanting. Mara found it exactly characteristic. "She's so like you," Rebecca said, watching Isabella conduct her investigation of a birthday ribbon. "Everyone keeps saying that. It's because it keeps being true." Rebecca handed Mara a glass of something cold. "How are you?" Not the network, not the house you. Mara considered the question honestly. "Good," she said. "In the specific sense, in the daily sense." She watched her daughter and her husband across the garden. Cole was crouching to Isabella's level, narrating something about the ribbon that she appeared to find satisfying both of them in that particular mode of communication that had been their language since the hospital. "I'm in the right place, doing the right work, with the right people." She paused. "That's a specific and verifiable statement." "It is." Rebecca looked at them too. "You know, when you called me that first time, the conversation in my office about what you needed from the agreement, I thought the most likely outcome was civil co-parenting. Functional, but formal. I've seen it work plenty of times. And this isn't that." Rebecca smiled with the precision of someone who's rarely surprised, and is therefore allowing herself the satisfaction of being surprised. "This is something else entirely." "The direction," Mara said. "What?" "Nothing. Something Cole says." She looked at her family. He was right about it. Cole looked up across the garden as if registering the attention which he usually did. He held her gaze for a moment with the look that was simply his face, now the permanent one, the real one. Then he looked back at Isabella, who had arrived at a conclusion about the ribbon and was moving on to the next thing. Mara went to join them. She walked across the Dunbar garden in the March light, with the oaks coming into leaf around her and her daughter ahead of her moving through the world with her characteristic determination, and the man who was her husband watching both of them with the attention that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him, and that had turned out to be the most important thing. Not weaponized, not strategic. Just the specific quality of a man who paid attention to what mattered and had learned at significant cost to himself to know the difference. She'd followed money through extraordinary complexity for 4 years of her professional life. She'd documented structures and mapped flows and made the deliberately invisible legible. She'd been very good at it. This was harder and better than any of it. This was the thing she'd been building toward without having a category for it, the specific life, the chosen dailiness, the people who were hers because she'd chosen them and been chosen by them in return. She reached Cole and Isabella. Her daughter turned to look at her with the assessment face, the one that was entirely hers. Then she extended her hand, offering whatever she'd found as her most recent point of interest, a small stone pale and smooth from the garden path. She held it out with the complete confidence of someone offering a significant gift. Mara crouched down to her level and accepted it. "Thank you," she said seriously. Isabella appeared satisfied with this response. She turned back to the garden. Cole put his hand briefly on Mara's shoulder as she stood. Not a dramatic gesture, not an occasion, just the specific small language of two people who had built something together and were standing in the middle of it on a March afternoon with the oaks going green around them, and the future, whatever it was going to be, being exactly as uncertain as it needed to be, which was not frightening anymore, but simply the condition in which all real things existed, the only medium in which anything worth building had ever been built. She put the stone in her pocket. She kept it there. That was enough. Had been from the beginning. The whole thing choosing to stay, choosing to build, choosing the daily, ordinary, difficult real. The rest was just the doing of it. And they were very good at the doing of it, every day. The April after Isabella's first birthday, Mara drove south to the Oregon coast. She went alone. Cole had suggested it, actually, which was a form of understanding she still sometimes found surprising when it arrived without having to be asked for. He had said, "Take the time. Take the car. I have Isabella go see what you need to see." She'd driven south through the morning in the particular silence of a long road trip that is also a form of thinking the rain-keeping pace for the first hour and then giving way to the clear coastal weather that arrived like a different country south of the Columbia. She stopped at the viewpoint above the river where the Oregon side opened into the Washington shore.
The gorge was doing what the gorge did, holding the light differently from the rest of the landscape, the water moving through it with the patient authority of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years, and found the human activity along its banks mildly interesting but not particularly significant. She thought about the night she'd stood at the top of the bluff above it in the rain with 11 minutes and a duffel bag, and the terrible freedom of a future that was entirely unstructured. She had been so certain that night that the only move was away, that everything ahead of her required first getting distance from the thing behind her. She'd been right. She'd needed the distance. The distance had been the thing that made the return possible on terms she could live with, not a return to what had been, but to the same landscape with entirely different architecture. She drove to the coast road south of Astoria, the one she'd mentioned to Cole in November. The sea stacks were exactly as she'd remembered them, massive and specific, rising from the water at low tide, the kind of thing that made human time feel appropriately calibrated. The lighthouse was exactly where the 1880s had put it, functional and unmoved by the intervening years. She walked at the water's edge for an hour. She thought about the forensic network and the cases coming in, and Petra Kim, who was very good, and Ellen, who was doing well, and the other women whose financial histories she'd untangled or was in the process of untangling. She thought about what she was building and why it was the right thing to be building. She thought about Cole, about the consent decree hitting its final year and the compliance framework that had become genuinely integrated rather than externally imposed, and the specific daily ordinary person he'd become in the house on Dunbar Street. Not the powerful man or the reformed criminal or the careful architect of changed behavior, but just the person hers, Isabella's, committed to the direction in the daily specific way. She thought about Isabella, about the stone offered with both hands and the ribbon investigation and the triangulating the room and the way she moved through her world with the complete confidence of someone who had been told implicitly and explicitly that the world was available to her. She thought about the 11 minutes at the top of the bluff and the Hotel Georgia and the nursery she'd painted herself in a color she'd picked because it felt permanent. And she thought about the small stone in the pocket of the jacket she was wearing, the one Isabella had given her at the birthday party, which she'd transferred from pocket to pocket since March, because it felt like the right thing to carry. She took it out and looked at it, pale and smooth and ordinary, the kind of thing the garden path produced in quantity. No particular distinction, except that her daughter had chosen it and held it out with both hands. She put it back. The coast road north was the same road south, only lit differently in the afternoon. She drove through the place where the Columbia entered the Pacific, the two bodies of water meeting with the specific authority of things that were always going to be where they were going to be. She thought some things are exactly what they are. Some things don't require assessment beyond the fact of themselves. She crossed the border at the small crossing point she'd first used when she'd come north with a duffel bag and a secret and no idea what was ahead of her. And Canada let her back in with the same unremarkable efficiency as always, and she drove north through the May afternoon toward Vancouver and the oaks on Dunbar Street and the kitchen and the work and the people who were waiting for her. Cole texted at the Columbia River Bridge, "Isabella has opinions about dinner. Drive safe." She texted back, "Tell her I'm on my way." She drove north. The mountains were visible in the late afternoon light, the specific mountains, the ones she'd watched from the hotel window that first night, and from the prenatal clinic windows, and from the Dunbar Street kitchen on clear mornings. They were exactly where they'd been. They did not adjust for anything or anyone. She found this appropriate. She was almost home when she called Cole, because the drive was long enough that she could talk and still get there. He answered on the second ring. "How was it?" he said. "Good." She drove. "Clear. The sea stacks are real. I told you. You've seen them. Once. A long time ago." He paused. "I want to take Isabella someday, when she's old enough to remember it. She'll remember it before she can say she remembers it. Children take in more than we know." "Like her mother." "Like her mother," she agreed. The road ahead was the specific north of a route she knew well. Now the city materializing from the distance, as it always did, deliberate, complete, entirely where it was supposed to be. "Cole," she said. "Yeah, thank you for suggesting I go. You needed the miles." "I did." She drove. "I'm going to be there in an hour. We'll be here." She knew they would be. That was the thing that made the going possible, knowing that the being here was what it was, steady and consistent. The daily ordinary specific fact of two people and their daughter in a house with oaks in the backyard waiting. She drove north through the evening and across the border and through the neighborhood streets.
She'd learned the way you learn things you're going to keep without effort through repetition until they were simply where you lived. She pulled into the Dunbar Street driveway, and the Oaks were doing their May thing, and the kitchen light was on, and she could hear from outside the car, with the window down, the specific low voice of Cole, narrating something to Isabella, which meant Isabella was awake and holding court, and the evening was exactly what evenings on Dunbar Street were. She got out of the car. She went inside. There was nothing remarkable about the moment. No occasion, no arrival that required ceremony. She came through the door, and her husband was in the kitchen with her daughter, and the kitchen smelled like dinner, and the Oaks were visible through the back window going dark with the evening. Isabella saw her and made a sound that was not yet a word, but was unmistakably recognition. The specific sound of a person who had been waiting for someone and was satisfied that the waiting was over. Mara picked her up. She held her daughter and thought, this is the thing. This has always been the thing. The choosing it every day. The coming back to it. The ordinary daily return to the people who were hers because she'd chosen them, who had chosen her in return, who were building something together that had no architectural precedent except what they were making out of it every day. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the smooth, pale stone. She kept it there. That was enough. That was everything. That was finally and completely home. In the summer of the following year, the Pacific Forensic Advocacy Network published its first annual impact report. Mara wrote it herself with Petra's assistance on the data sections, and Rebecca's sharp eye on anything that would appear in a legal or regulatory context. The report documented 37 cases in the first full operational year, 17 resolved favorably through court proceedings, 11 through negotiated settlements that had been made possible by the forensic documentation, 6 through processes still ongoing, 3 that had not produced the outcomes hoped for, but had still provided the clients with clarity about their situation that they had not previously had. The average financial harm documented per case was significant. The average resolution was more significant still. Diane Whelan wrote a foreword that was 3 paragraphs and precise. Mara had not written a version of the report that told the origin story of the organization, not where the forensic skill came from, not the complicated intersecting histories that had led to a woman with her specific background building this specific thing. The report was about the work, not the worker. She intended to keep it that way. But she knew the origin story. Cole knew it. Rebecca and Diane and Sandra Fitch in her way, and Tom Whelan knew it. The women whose cases were in the report knew their own parts of it. It was a story about what happened when the skills built for one purpose were redirected toward another. When someone who had spent years making invisible financial structures visible for federal prosecutorial purposes realized that the same skill applied in a different direction could make the same invisible structures visible for the people trapped inside them. When the trajectory of a professional life bent towards something that turned out to be exactly what it was supposed to be, even if the path there had been indirect and sometimes costly, and not at all what any prior version of the plan had included. Cole read the report when it was done. He sat at the kitchen table with it for 20 minutes, read it straight through, and then set it down and said, "This is excellent work." The methodology section is Petra's.
All of it is excellent. He looked at her. You should be proud of this.
I'm satisfied with it. Pride is... She paused. Pride implies it's finished. It's not finished. This is the first year. The first year of many, presumably. He picked it up again and looked at the cover plain functional her name and the network's name. You're going to be known for this, he said. People in the field are going to know your name in connection with this specifically. That's the point. I know it's the point. He set it down again. I just want to say for the record that I know what it cost you to get to the point. The detour through my world, what you gave up and what you had to navigate, and how you managed to build this out of a situation that started as something entirely different. He held her eyes. I know. I don't think I've said that directly. Mara looked at him across the kitchen table, at the man who had been her investigation subject and her personal catastrophe, and her husband and the father of her daughter, and the person she'd built the house on Dunbar Street with, at all the versions of him she'd cataloged, and the one who remained underneath all of them. You've been saying it, she said, every day, in the way that doesn't require words. I want to say it in words, too. All right, I know what it cost you. He said it plainly with the directness of someone who had learned that plainness was the only form of honesty he could fully account for. And I'm grateful for every choice you made that led you here, including the ones that were about leaving me.
including the running, because the running is why the return was possible on terms that were real. He paused. If you'd stayed in September, if you'd never left, we'd have been something else. Something I think we'd both have outgrown. The running was necessary, she said. The running was necessary, he agreed. And the staying was a choice. That matters. It always matters, she said, when you choose to stay. Isabella appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, which she did increasingly on her own steam, with the focused purposefulness that had been her signature since before she was born. She assessed the situation, both parents at the kitchen table, the quality of the room, whatever information she gathered from the combination, and determined that this was a room worth joining. She crossed the kitchen on her sturdy 14-month legs and arrived at Mara's chair and held up both hands, which was her established signal for up, and also for I have decided this is where I am now. Mara picked her up. Isabella settled against her mother's shoulder with the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted that this was available to her, and looked at her father across the table and made one of her characteristic pronouncements, specific and emphatic and entirely her own. Cole smiled. The real one. The one that transformed his face the way it had at a Portland reception a long time ago, when Mara had looked across a room and found it arriving at her with the unsettling precision of something she hadn't prepared for. Agreed? He said to his daughter. Completely. Mara looked at the two of them, at Isabella's confident face and Cole's real smile, and the kitchen that was their kitchen in the house. That was their house on the street with the oaks that were doing their oaks. In summer thing outside the window, and felt the feeling she still sometimes caught herself verifying before accepting the feeling of being in the right place at the right time, with the right people, doing work that mattered in a life that had been chosen. She accepted it. She always did eventually. The stone from the garden was still in her pocket. She'd moved it to this jacket when she'd worn this jacket first, the same way she moved it whenever she changed jackets, because it was the right thing to carry. A pale, smooth, ordinary thing that her daughter had offered with both hands, which made it significant, which made it worth keeping. Some things were like that. Unremarkable in themselves, but made significant by the specific act of being chosen and offered and received. She knew a lot of things that were like that. She counted them sometimes quietly in the inventory style she'd never quite unlearned from her professional years. The Dunbar Oaks, the decaf coffee at 8 o'clock, the January ring and the summer garden, and the 14 people and the borrowed chairs. Isabella's triangulating and the stone and the real smile across the kitchen table. The direction consistently offered, the return chosen each time. The daily ordinary specific life built from real materials and carrying all of them. The thing itself. She counted them and found them sufficient and more than sufficient, and she held her daughter and met her husband's eyes, and the July afternoon came through the kitchen window in the way that July afternoons did when they were committed to being exactly what they were. It was enough. It had always been enough. It was, in fact, everything.